My husband kicked me out of his luxury SUV into a freezing Seattle rainstorm with absolutely nothing. He had just stolen our entire life savings and canceled my credit cards right to my face, claiming he was teaching me a lesson in survival. He thought he was discarding a worthless leech. He had no idea that a blind old woman sitting at that very bus stop was about to hand me the keys to a billion-dollar financial empire, and that the lesson in survival would soon be his. If you love seeing arrogant people get exactly what they deserve, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me where you are watching from in the comments. My name is Stella, I am 34 years old, and this is the story of how I took everything back. The night. It all fell apart. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the windshield of Jason's brand new Range Rover. The heated leather seats felt like a cruel joke compared to the ice in my veins. We were driving back from a high society dinner party where I had played the supportive quiet wife to the rising tech logistics CEO. But my mind was entirely focused on the notification I had received on my phone just hours earlier. I had logged into our joint banking portal and found a balance of zero. $200,000, our entire life savings, the money I had painstakingly managed during the lean years of his startup, was gone. It had been wired to an offshore account controlled by an LLC. An LLC I had quickly traced back to Sienna, his vice president of operations, the woman I knew he was sleeping with. I had kept quiet through the agonizing evening, waiting for the moment we were alone. As we navigated the dark roads of the Seattle suburbs, I finally confronted him. I demanded to know where the money was. I expected denial. I did not expect the chillingly calm smile that spread across his face. He did not even look at me. He just kept his eyes on the wet road ahead. Yes, I moved the funds, he said, his tone as casual as if discussing the weather. Sienna knows how to handle capital. You just hoard it. I sat there stunned by the sheer audacity of his words. Hoard it? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and betrayal. Jason. I paused my career as a senior financial analyst to build your company. I wrote the supply chain optimization algorithms that made your software functional. I worked 80-hour weeks for free so you could afford to pay your developers. That money was our safety net. Jason scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that filled the small space. You wrote some basic code 5 years ago, Stella. Get over yourself. The company is successful because of my vision and Sienna's operational genius. You have contributed absolutely nothing of value since we launched. You are just a leech living off my hard work. He was completely rewriting our history, erasing my sacrifices to justify his greed. I told him I would not let him get away with it. I told him I would call my lawyers the second we got home and freeze every asset tied to his name. That was my mistake. I showed my hand before I had any power to back it up. Jason slammed on the brakes. The heavy vehicle screeched to a halt beside a deserted, unlit bus stop on a desolate stretch of road miles from our neighborhood. The sudden stop threw me forward against the seatbelt. Before I could process what was happening, Jason leaned across the console. He grabbed the handle of the passenger door and shoved it open. The roaring sound of the storm flooded the cabin, bringing a blast of freezing wind and rain. Get out, he ordered. I stared at him, paralyzed by confusion. What? Get out of my car, Stella. He unbuckled my seatbelt with a vicious yank. When I did not move fast enough, he planted his hand firmly on my shoulder and shoved me violently out the open door. I tumbled out onto the wet, slick pavement, scraping my knees and palms. The icy rain soaked through my thin evening dress in seconds. Before I could even stand up, he grabbed my designer purse from the floorboard and hurled it directly at my chest. I caught the bag, scrambling to my feet. I opened it instinctively, my hands shaking uncontrollably from the cold and the shock. My wallet was unzipped. The small amount of emergency cash I usually kept, there was gone. He had planned this entirely. Jason rolled down his window, rain pouring into the pristine interior of his luxury car. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, holding it up so the screen illuminated his smug, arrogant face. Watch closely, he sneered. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, he opened our banking application. Right in front of my eyes, he navigated to the credit card controls. You wanted to call lawyers? Try paying retainer fees with this. He tapped the screen. A bright red notification popped up confirming that my only remaining credit card had just been canceled. You have nothing, Stella. You are nothing without me. Do whatever you want. Consider this a lesson in survival. He hit the button to close the window. The massive tires of the SUV spun on the wet asphalt, kicking a spray of dirty water over my legs as the vehicle surged forward. I stood shivering under the meager shelter, left utterly alone in the dark. The freezing rain whipped against my bare legs and soaked through the thin fabric of my evening dress. I fumbled for my phone with numb, trembling fingers. The screen flickered to life, glaring brightly in the pitch-black night. 5% battery remaining. It was a ticking clock on my only lifeline. I bypassed my contacts and directly opened the family group chat. Jason's family. The people I had spent the last 7 years cooking holiday dinners for, remembering birthdays, and supporting through every crisis. I typed frantically, my thumbs slipping on the wet glass. Jason left me at the highway bus stop. He took all our money and canceled my cards. Please, I am freezing. Can someone come get me? I stared at the delivery status. Read. Amber, Jason's younger sister, was typing. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. Amber would help. I had paid off her student loans when Jason's startup first hit profitability. I had spent countless weekends helping her craft resumes and prepare for job interviews. A voice note popped up. I pressed play, holding the speaker tightly against my ear over the roaring sound of the storm. Amber's voice rang out sharp and dripping with amusement. Oh, Stella, still playing the victim, I see. Jason told us you were acting completely unhinged tonight. Maybe spending a night on the streets will teach you some humility. You have been riding my brother's coattails long enough. You deserve exactly what you are getting, you dramatic loser. I stared at the screen, the cruelty of her words stinging worse than the ice hitting my skin. Before I could even process the betrayal, another notification chimed. It was DeAndre, Amber's husband. The man who always greeted me with a wide smile and a warm hug at family barbecues. The charismatic guy who used my free financial consulting to set up his own real estate holding companies. He sent an animated image of a cartoon character getting swept away in a flood, followed immediately by a text message. Tough break, sis. I hear the overpass on 4th Avenue stays pretty dry. Better start walking. A final notification popped up from Jason himself. A single thumbs-up emoji in response to DeAndre's message. They were all in on it. The entire family had been waiting for the moment Jason finally discarded me. They fully supported his cruelty, treating my absolute devastation like a private joke. The screen glitched, flashing a critical low battery warning. I frantically tried to type a response, desperately wanting to scream at them through the digital void, but the screen went entirely black. My phone was dead. The sudden silence of the dead device was deafening. I sank onto the cold metal bench of the bus shelter, pulling my knees to my chest. The reality of my situation crushed the breath right out of my lungs. No money, no phone, no shelter, no allies. I had spent my entire adult life building a solid foundation for a man who had just gleefully demolished it, cheered on by his blood relatives. The rhythmic tapping of metal against concrete cut through the relentless sound of the storm. I lifted my head. Emerging from the heavy curtain of rain was an elderly woman. She wore a pristine, tailored waterproof trench coat and held a white cane. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, entirely untouched by the brutal weather. She stepped under the plexiglass shelter, shaking the moisture from her coat with measured precision. I wiped the freezing rain from my eyes, trying to make sense of the surreal sight. What was an elderly, blind woman doing walking alone on a deserted highway in the middle of a winter storm? I pulled my wet dress tightly around my shoulders, trying to make myself as small and unnoticeable as possible. You are shivering loud enough to wake the dead, the woman said. Her voice was remarkably steady, carrying a tone of absolute authority that commanded immediate attention. And your breathing is shallow. Panic, anger. Which is it? Both, I managed to say, my teeth chattering violently. I am sorry, I do not have any money if that is what you want. The woman let out a dry, humorless chuckle. I have more money than God, child. What I do not have is time for fools. I heard that entire pathetic voice note playing from your phone. I heard the engine of that overpriced SUV speed away. Your husband abandoned you and his family applauded. I stared at her sightless eyes, completely bewildered. You heard all of that? My hearing is impeccable, she stated, turning her head accurately in my direction. My name is Beatrice, and you, from the sound of that rather pathetic digital exchange, are a woman who just lost everything to a group of arrogant, greedy amateurs. They are not amateurs, I countered defensive despite my misery. He is a tech CEO. They just took my entire life savings and locked me out of my own accounts. Amateurs, Beatrice repeated dismissively, tapping her cane on the concrete. Stealing joint savings and leaving a spouse stranded is the tactic of a street thug, not a corporate titan. It is sloppy. It leaves a mess. And right now, you are the mess. She stepped closer, the sharp scent of expensive custom-blended perfume cutting through the damp air. I run a corporate empire that is currently infested with rats. Vultures in expensive suits who think my blindness makes me weak and my age makes me oblivious. I need someone to exterminate them. Someone with a sharp, uncorrupted financial mind. Someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Why me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You do not even know me. I know that you understand supply chain algorithms and startup capital management based on the argument you had in that vehicle before you were violently ejected. Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. I know you are analytical enough to track hidden funds to an offshore corporate account. And I know you are currently fueled by the kind of pure, unadulterated rage that makes a person dangerous. She gripped her cane with both hands, her sightless eyes seeming to pierce right through me. I need a proxy, a weapon. If you agree to act as my granddaughter and execute my orders within my firm, I will give you the keys to the kingdom. I will hand you the absolute financial power to crush the people who just discarded you. You will not just ruin your husband, you will dismantle his entire existence. I stared at the blind woman standing before me. The sheer magnitude of her promise hung in the freezing air, heavier than the rain beating down on the plexiglass roof. Dismantle his entire existence. The words echoed in my mind, igniting a spark of pure adrenaline that cut straight through my hypothermia. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, a pair of blinding LED headlights pierced the darkness. A massive jet-black Maybach glided silently to a halt right at the edge of the curb, its heavy tires displacing the flooded street. The vehicle was armored, sitting low and dense like a military tank dressed in bespoke luxury. The driver's side door opened instantly. A man stepped out into the downpour. He wore a sharply tailored suit and an earpiece, and the unmistakable bulge of a shoulder holster pressed against his jacket. He paid zero attention to the storm. He walked directly to Beatrice, bowed deeply from the waist, and spoke with absolute reverence. The car is ready, Madam Chairman. Beatrice merely nodded. She turned her face toward me one last time. The door is open, Stella. You can stay here and freeze, hoping the people who threw you away will magically develop a conscience, or you can get in the car. I looked down at my scraped knees and my soaked, ruined dress. I looked at the dark highway where Jason had sped away laughing. I did not hesitate for another second. I stepped forward and climbed into the plush heated leather interior of the Maybach. As the heavy armored door slammed shut behind me, completely silencing the raging storm outside, I made a conscious decision. The desperate weeping wife who begged for a ride in a family group chat was dead. Dead. I left her body on that wet pavement. The driver pulled smoothly back onto the highway. The interior of the vehicle smelled of rich leather and aged cedar. The ambient temperature was incredibly warm, immediately thawing the ice in my veins. I expected a blanket. I expected a hot drink. I expected at least a superficial question about how I was holding up. Beatrice provided none of those things. The privacy partition between us and the driver slid up with a soft mechanical whir, sealing us in total isolation. Beatrice tapped her cane once against the floorboard. We do not have time for pleasantries, she snapped, her voice shifting into a rapid, aggressive cadence. If you are going to wield my power, I need to know your brain is not as fragile as your marriage. Consider this your interview. It starts now. I blinked, still shivering slightly, but I forced my posture upright. Go ahead. A technology startup is bleeding cash in its third quarter, she fired off. They need a bridge loan to survive until their Series C funding round. The founders hold 60% equity. The angel investors hold 20. The venture capital firm holds the rest with a full ratchet anti-dilution provision. If the startup accepts a down round of financing at a 40% lower valuation, how do you restructure the capitalization table to wipe out the founder's control without triggering a lawsuit? My mind locked onto the numbers instantly. The cold vanished. I knew this game. I had built financial models like this in my sleep while Jason took all the credit. You do not touch the equity directly, I answered, my voice steady and cold. You offer them a convertible note with a toxic interest rate and a multiple liquidation preference. When the down round hits, the venture capital firm converts their debt into equity at a massive discount. The anti-dilution provision kicks in, flooding the venture firm with new shares to protect their initial investment price. The founders get diluted into absolute oblivion. They lose their voting rights, they lose their board seats, and they lose the company legally. They cannot sue because they signed the convertible note out of desperation. Beatrice tilted her head slightly. Acceptable. Now tax evasion. A logistics CEO wants to siphon $200,000 of marital assets into an offshore account without triggering the IRS or his estranged spouse. He uses a Delaware limited liability company as a shell. He names his mistress as the registered agent. How do you break the corporate veil and seize the money? She was testing me with my own life. I did not flinch. A Delaware LLC offers anonymity, but it is not bulletproof, I fired back. If the CEO commingled personal funds with the corporate shell, which he did by transferring joint marital savings directly into the business account, the corporate veil is automatically pierced. You do not go after the offshore account first. You go after the registered agent. You subpoena the mistress for tax fraud, claiming she received unregistered income. To avoid federal prison, she will have to prove the money belongs to the CEO. She will hand over the financial ledgers herself. The offshore account gets frozen by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the CEO is indicted for wire fraud. Beatrice leaned closer, her sightless eyes fixed perfectly on my face. You are fast. But are you ruthless? What if the CEO uses dummy real estate investments to clean the money? What if he uses his own family members as the legal owners of the properties to distance himself from the crime? I stared at the dark window, watching the rain streak across the glass. I thought of Amber and DeAndre laughing at me, telling me to sleep under a bridge while living in houses I had helped finance. You weaponize the IRS, I said, my tone completely devoid of mercy. You trigger a shadow audit. Family members acting as straw buyers never pay the proper capital gains taxes because they treat the illegal assets as personal piggy banks. You flag their tax returns for immediate review. When the federal auditors knock on their doors, family loyalty evaporates. They will turn state's evidence and sell out the CEO to save themselves from tax evasion charges. You let them tear each other apart from the inside. The Maybach glided through a set of massive wrought iron security gates. Beatrice leaned back against the headrest. The tension in the vehicle suddenly dissipated. A slow, grim smile spread across her aged features. It was a terrifying, beautiful smile. She did not need to see me to know exactly what I was capable of. She had been looking for a financial assassin, and I had just proven that I possessed the perfect combination of elite corporate knowledge and absolute unadulterated vengeance. The Maybach slowed as we approached a sprawling illuminated estate that looked more like a fortress than a home. Beatrice tapped her cane twice on the floorboard. Welcome to Kensington Holdings, Stella. I have found my weapon. Let us begin the slaughter. The heavy armored doors of the Maybach clicked open. The storm raged relentlessly, but a synchronized team of estate staff, holding massive black umbrellas, instantly formed a dry protective tunnel from the vehicle to the entrance. I stepped out onto the polished stone driveway of the Kensington estate. It was not just a mansion. It was a modern, impenetrable fortress, built of reinforced glass, steel, and concrete, perched high on a private cliff overlooking the churning, black waters of the Puget Sound. High-resolution security cameras tracked our every movement from the shadows. Armed guards stood at the perimeter with military precision. This was the true nerve center of a financial empire, hidden away in the dark woods of the Pacific Northwest, far from the glittering downtown high-rises. We moved through the grand entrance into a cavernous foyer. The silence inside was absolute, engineered by thick acoustic paneling that completely erased the roaring storm outside. Beatrice handed her wet trench coat to a waiting attendant without breaking her stride. She tapped her white cane against the imported marble floor, navigating the massive space with a confident, practiced rhythm. "Follow me," she ordered. I followed her down a long, dimly lit corridor, lined with museum-quality artwork, my ruined heels leaving faint, damp footprints on the polished stone. We entered a sprawling private office. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany desk and wall-to-wall screens, displaying real-time global market data. The financial heartbeat of the world illuminated the dark room with a cold blue glow, tracking everything from Asian market indices to local tech sector valuations. Beatrice moved behind the desk and pressed a concealed button. The heavy oak doors sealed shut behind us, with the heavy, definitive thud of a bank vault locking into place. "Sit," she commanded. I sank into a high-backed leather chair across from her, my wet dress still clinging uncomfortably to my skin. "You know who I am now," Beatrice said, resting her hands on the silver handle of her cane. Kensington Holdings controls over $40 billion in venture capital across the West Coast. We dictate which technology startups live and which ones bleed out. We control the supply chains, the real estate developments, and the software infrastructures of tomorrow. I built this empire with my bare hands over 50 ruthless years. But immense power always attracts parasites. She turned her sightless eyes toward the glowing market screens, her jaw tightening. "My vision is entirely gone. My doctors inform me my heart is operating on borrowed time. The precise moment my physical weakness presented itself, the vultures in my boardroom began circling. The senior partners, the hedge fund managers, the board of directors. They are quietly maneuvering behind my back to declare me medically unfit to lead." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the quiet room. "They want to invoke a competency clause to strip my voting rights, carve up my life's work, and liquidate the most valuable assets for their own personal gain." I leaned forward, ignoring the cold. The financial strategist inside me, immediately analyzing the corporate battlefield. "They are staging a silent boardroom coup, waiting for you to miss a step or sign the wrong document so they can trigger a legal takeover in Delaware Chancery Court." "Exactly," Beatrice replied sharply. "They think because I cannot read a physical balance sheet with my own eyes, I cannot see their embezzlement. They are funding hollow, worthless startups in exchange for under-the-table kickbacks. They are bleeding Kensington Holdings dry from the inside out, padding their own offshore accounts. I cannot trust a single executive currently sitting in this building." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous, commanding whisper. "That is where you come in, Stella. I do not need a nurse. I do not need a friend. I need a shadow proxy. I need someone who can read the ledgers, audit the upcoming funding proposals, and execute my authority with absolute ruthless precision. You have no loyalties to my board members. You cannot be bribed or intimidated because you have a singular burning motivation that money cannot buy. Pure, unadulterated vengeance." I felt my heart pounding against my ribs, matching the relentless rhythm of the rain outside the bulletproof windows. "You want me to audit your entire venture capital firm." "I want you to purge it," Beatrice corrected coldly. "I am creating a new hidden executive tier for you, Director of Strategic Acquisitions. You will answer exclusively to me. You will hold absolute unchecked authority over the firm's next funding cycle. You will decide who gets capital and whose financial throat gets cut. In exchange for cleaning my house and identifying the traitors, I will hand you the entire weight of Kensington Holdings to crush your husband." The offer was staggering. Jason thought he had left me with nothing. He thought canceling a credit card and abandoning me in the rain was the ultimate display of power. He was a small-time hustler playing with stolen pennies. Beatrice was handing me the nuclear launch codes to the entire Seattle financial district. "I accept," I said. My voice did not shake. There was no hesitation. I wanted Jason and his entire parasitic family decimated. Beatrice smiled grimly. "Good. Then it is time to shed the skin of the victim." She pressed an intercom button on her desk. "Send the estate manager in." The heavy vault doors opened silently. A woman in a crisp uniform entered carrying a heavy garment bag and a pair of pristine black stilettos. Beatrice gestured toward a set of double doors leading to an attached private suite. There is a full bathroom through there. Wash off the rain. Wash off the pathetic, arrogant husband who thought you were disposable. Put on the suit. When you step back into this office, you will no longer be a discarded wife. You will be the executioner. I took the garment bag and walked into the luxurious suite. The bathroom was lined with black marble and featured heated floors that instantly warmed my freezing feet. I stripped off the ruined-soaked evening dress. It clung to my skin like a heavy, suffocating weight, representing the last 7 years of my life. I thought about the late nights balancing the books for Jason's startup, the free consulting I gave DeAndre to set up his shady real estate LLCs, the money I handed Amber to clear her debts. I dropped the dress directly into the trash can. I stepped into the massive glass shower and turned the water as hot as I could stand. The scalding water washed over me, rinsing away the freezing rain, the humiliation of the bus stop, and the lingering scent of Jason's luxury SUV. As the heat penetrated my aching muscles, the shock finally wore off completely, replaced by a pure crystallized focus. I thought about Jason's arrogant smirk. I thought about Amber's mocking voice note and DeAndre's cruel jokes. They felt so safe in their stolen wealth. They felt absolutely untouchable. I stepped out of the shower and dried off. I unzipped the garment bag. Inside was a custom-tailored razor-sharp designer suit in deep charcoal gray, paired with a crisp, high-collared white silk blouse. It fit flawlessly, wrapping around me like corporate armor. I slipped on the black stilettos. I pulled my wet hair back into a sleek, severe knot that pulled the skin tight across my cheekbones. I looked at myself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The woman staring back at me was unrecognizable. The obedient, supportive wife who worked 80-hour weeks in the shadows to build a man's ego was dead. She had frozen to death on the side of the highway. The woman in the mirror was cold, calculating, and armed with billions of dollars in corporate firepower. The new apex predator of the Seattle financial district had just been born. I turned away from the mirror and walked out of the suite. The stilettos clicked sharply against the marble floor, a steady, rhythmic sound that echoed with undeniable purpose. I stepped back into the massive private office. Beatrice was waiting behind her desk, her hands resting patiently on her cane. She heard my footsteps approach and nodded approvingly. "You sound different," Beatrice noted, a hint of dark amusement in her tone. "You sound lethal." "I am ready," I said. I walked around the massive desk, taking the executive seat right beside her, and pulled a blank legal pad and a silver pen toward me. "Give me the firm's internal ledgers. We have rats to exterminate, and I want to start laying the traps tonight." 10 miles away in downtown Seattle, high above the glittering rain-slicked city streets, champagne cascaded into two crystal flutes. The penthouse executive suite of Vanguard Logistics was a monument to unearned wealth. It was decorated with imported Italian leather, custom marble fixtures, and expensive modern art, all purchased with stolen money. Jason clinked his glass against Sienna's. Sienna, wearing a skin-tight designer dress paid for by my drained savings account, threw her head back and laughed. She was 28, utterly ruthless and desperate to secure her permanent place in Seattle high society. She had started as a mediocre mid-level manager, but Jason had promoted her to vice president of operations the exact same week their affair began. To the newly single CEO, Sienna purred, taking a long sip of her champagne. "I still cannot believe you actually kicked her out into the storm. Did she cry?" "She was too busy shivering to cry," Jason sneered, loosening his expensive silk tie. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the city traffic below. "I canceled her final credit card right to her face. She has absolutely zero leverage. By tomorrow morning, she will be begging to sign whatever garbage settlement my lawyers throw at her just to afford a hot meal in a diner." Sienna walked over to the massive wall-to-wall interactive display monitor at the far end of the executive office. She ran a perfectly manicured fingernail along the glowing lines of complex code scrolling across the screen. And she actually thought she was going to take half of this company. It is almost adorable how delusional she is. She honestly believed she was your equal. Jason pressed a button on his remote control, expanding the lines of code into a massive three-dimensional supply chain matrix. It was a masterpiece of financial and logistical engineering. The software was a predictive algorithm capable of anticipating international shipping delays, rerouting global freight in real time, and slashing operational costs by an unprecedented 30% across all borders. It was brilliant. It was flawless. And it belonged entirely to me. I had spent 3 grueling years writing that exact code. I had missed holidays, skipped meals, and sacrificed my own career advancement as a senior financial analyst to build the digital backbone of Vanguard Logistics from our tiny guest bedroom. I had poured my intellect and my health into that software. Jason had smiled and kissed my forehead every single night, promising me that we were building our future empire together as a team. Now Jason stood in his $1 million office and took absolute unquestioned credit for my genius. The patent filings officially cleared this morning, he announced, his voice dripping with suffocating arrogance. He tapped the digital screen again, bringing up the official federal legal documents. I had our corporate legal team completely expunge her name from all the origin records and developer logs. As far as the United States government is concerned, I wrote the core algorithm from scratch, and you designed the operational interface. Sienna smiled hungrily, wrapping her arms around his neck. So the leech is officially scraped off our shoes. Now we can finally move forward with the real money. The Series C funding round, Jason said, his eyes gleaming with sheer, unadulterated greed. We are not just asking for a standard bridge loan anymore. With this algorithm fully secured under my name, we are launching a $50 million capital raise. This is the valuation that puts Vanguard Logistics on the map and puts us permanently in the billionaire bracket. Sienna pulled away slightly, her expression turning sharp and calculating. But we are burning through our operational cash right now. You know we are. DeAndre called me twice today, demanding more money to cover the property taxes on those residential shell companies we set up for him in Amber. Plus, our primary bank is already asking uncomfortable questions about our last quarterly report. We need a massive institutional investor to cover the financial gaps before anyone looks too closely at our actual shipping revenues. If the auditors realize you have been siphoning company funds to buy real estate, we are both going to federal prison. That is exactly why we are not pitching to standard conservative banks, Jason replied confidently, waving away her concerns. He walked over to his heavy mahogany desk and picked up a thick gold-embossed presentation folder. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table with a satisfying thud. We are going straight to the absolute top of the food chain. We are pitching to Kensington Holdings. Sienna gasped, her eyes widening with immediate greedy excitement. Kensington. They are notoriously ruthless. They destroy companies for fun. But if they back us, every other venture capital firm in the Pacific Northwest will fall in line immediately. Exactly, Jason said, pouring himself another generous glass of champagne. And this is the perfect time to strike. My inside sources tell me the firm is in absolute chaos right now. Beatrice Kensington is blind, pushing 80 years old, and her health is rapidly failing. The senior partners are so busy trying to carve up her empire and plot their own successions that nobody is paying attention to the fine details of the incoming portfolios. They are desperate for a massive, flashy tech win to stabilize their public image and prove they still dominate the market. We walk in there, dazzle the dying old woman with my algorithm, and walk out with a $50 million check. What about the due diligence process? Sienna asked, a brief flash of hesitation crossing her face. Kensington is famous for their forensic financial audits. If their analysts dig into the offshore accounts or DeAndre's real estate purchases, they will instantly spot the irregularities. Jason laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed off the expensive glass walls. There will be no forensic audit. I already bribed an associate director at Kensington to fast-track our application past the initial review board. By the time the money hits our accounts, we will be completely untouchable. Beatrice Kensington is a relic of the past. She cannot even see the documents she is signing. We are going to bleed her venture firm dry, just like we bled Stella dry. Jason pulled Sienna close, pressing a kiss to her neck. Pack your bags, babe. Once the Kensington money clears, we are flying to Monaco to celebrate. Let my useless ex-wife figure out how to survive on the streets. We are about to become royalty. They stood in the penthouse, entirely consumed by their own vanity and stolen achievements. They believed they had committed the perfect crime. They believed they had erased me completely from the narrative. They had no idea that they had just targeted the exact venture capital firm I now controlled. They had no idea that while they were toasting to my demise, I was already sitting in Beatrice Kensington's private soundproof vault, loading their $50 million pitch deck onto my high-resolution screen, preparing to financially execute them both. The heavy vault doors of Beatrice Kensington's private office sealed me inside a fortress of absolute silence. I sat bathed in the cold blue light of a massive curved monitor, staring directly at the Vanguard Logistics $50 million pitch deck. Jason and Sienna had just uploaded the file to the secure Kensington investor portal. They thought their submission was being routed to a faceless committee of junior analysts. They had no idea it was routed directly to my personal server. I opened the main presentation file. Jason had spared no expense on the graphic design. The slides were slick, filled with buzzwords about global disruption and limitless scalability. But I did not care about the marketing fluff. I bypassed the executive summary and clicked straight into the technical appendix. The digital pages loaded, revealing the core architecture of the supply chain predictive algorithm. My breath caught in my throat. My hands clenched into fists over the sleek glass desk. There it was, my life's work. I recognized every line of logic, every predictive routing model, every complex mathematical equation. I had written the foundation of this code while sitting at our cramped kitchen table at 3 in the morning, surviving on cold coffee while Jason slept comfortably in the next room. I had debugged the routing protocols while recovering from a severe bout of pneumonia because Jason begged me, claiming the company would fail without my help. He had stripped my name from the title page and replaced it with his own. He had stolen my genius and packaged it as a golden ticket to billionaire status. I moved my cursor over the bright red reject button at the bottom of the screen. One click, and their $50 million dream would be instantly vaporized. I hovered over the icon. It would be so incredibly easy to crush them right now. But easy was not what I wanted. Easy was a swift execution. Jason did not deserve a swift execution. If I rejected them now, they would simply take my stolen algorithm and pitch it to another venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. I needed to trap them. I needed to lock them inside a financial cage where no other investor could ever reach them. I moved my cursor away from the red button and clicked the glowing green icon labeled Approve for final due diligence. Beatrice sat in her high-backed leather chair across the room, listening to the sharp click of the mouse. She rested her chin on her hands, leaning forward slightly. "You approved the pitch," she stated, her sightless eyes tracking the sound. "You found the rat and you opened the door for him. Explain your strategy, Stella. If I reject his proposal, he will take his stolen intellectual property to our competitors," I explained, my voice echoing coldly in the vault. "We need to lure him deep inside Kensington Holdings. We approve the initial pitch, which will make Jason incredibly arrogant. He will think he has won. Then we issue a customized term sheet for the Series C funding round." I pulled up a blank legal contract on my screen and began typing rapidly. "I am drafting a binding term sheet with a strict exclusivity clause," I continued. "A 90-day non-shop provision. Once Jason signs this, it becomes a federal crime for Vanguard Logistics to solicit funding from any other venture capital firm or private equity group for the next 3 months." Beatrice smiled, a dangerous, razor-sharp expression. "He will be legally handcuffed to us. And since you already deduced that his company is currently burning through their operational cash, 90 days of exclusivity will bleed his corporate accounts entirely dry. He will be completely at our mercy." "Exactly," I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I wove the legal traps together. "But Jason is greedy and impatient. He will need a bridge loan to survive the 90-day due diligence period before the $50 million payout. I am authorizing a $2 million immediate bridge loan from Kensington Holdings to cover his short-term operational costs." "You are giving the man who left you to freeze on the highway $2 million of my money?" Beatrice asked, her tone testing my resolve. "I am giving him the rope to hang himself," I answered flatly. "The bridge loan comes with a toxic collateral provision. To access the immediate $2 million, Jason must sign a personal guarantee. He will have to leverage all of his personal assets, his equity in the company, and the deed to his penthouse. Furthermore, the contract stipulates an invasive mandatory forensic audit managed by a third-party proxy, representing Kensington Holdings. That proxy will be me. I scrolled through the dense legal jargon I had just drafted. Once he signs this term sheet, he grants us unrestricted, legally binding access to every single bank account, offshore ledger, and real estate holding connected to Vanguard Logistics. We will not just find the money he stole from me. We will uncover every fraudulent shell company he operates with DeAndre. Beatrice tapped her white cane against the floor in a steady, approving rhythm. You are weaponizing the due diligence process. You are turning standard corporate compliance into an execution block. You have my absolute authorization, Stella. Gut his company. Strip him to the bone. Make sure when you are finished he has nothing left but the clothes on his back. I finalized the term sheet applying the official digital seal of Kensington Holdings. I set the sender address to a generic executive compliance email, ensuring Jason would have no idea who was truly pulling the strings on the other side of the screen. I hit send. The trap was officially set. Within 10 minutes, my secure terminal chimed with a high-priority incoming notification. Jason had already opened the email. I sat back in the plush leather chair and watched the digital tracking receipt on my monitor. I could perfectly picture him standing in his lavish penthouse with Sienna popping another bottle of expensive champagne, completely oblivious to the reality of his situation. He was reading the term sheet. He was blinded by the promise of $50 million. I was ignoring the lethal fine print hiding in the collateral clauses. A second notification flashed across the screen. Vanguard Logistics had digitally signed the term sheet. Jason had just legally surrendered his entire company, his personal assets, and his future to Kensington Holdings. He had willingly locked himself inside a burning building, handing me the only key to the exit. I smiled at the glowing monitor, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The hunt had officially begun, and Jason was walking blindly into the slaughterhouse. 2 days later, the torrential storms that had battered Seattle finally broke, leaving the city skies a cold, brilliant gray. I was sitting at a corner table inside the Reserve, an ultra-exclusive coffee lounge located on the ground floor of a towering financial district high-rise. It was the kind of establishment where million-dollar acquisitions were casually negotiated over $30 espresso pours. I was sipping a black coffee, calmly reviewing the encrypted digital readouts from Kensington Holdings on my tablet. The $2 million bridge loan had successfully cleared Vanguard Logistics' corporate accounts that morning. Jason had swallowed the bait whole. He was currently spending Kensington capital to keep his supply chain operational, completely oblivious to the forensic audit algorithms I had silently attached to the funds. I took another sip of coffee when a shadow fell across my screen. I did not need to look up to know who it was. The sharp, overwhelming scent of Jason's expensive cologne preceded him. I locked the screen of my tablet and slowly raised my eyes. Jason stood over my table. He was flanked by two men in impeccable, aggressive pinstripe suits clutching heavy leather briefcases. They were corporate litigators, the kind of ruthless legal mercenaries who billed by the minute to destroy people. Jason himself looked incredibly smug, practically vibrating with the arrogant energy of a man who believed he was moments away from a $50 million venture capital payout. He did not look at me with anger. He looked at me with sheer, unadulterated contempt. He leaned his hands on the edge of my marble table, invading my personal space. You actually thought you could hide from me? Jason sneered, his voice low enough to avoid drawing the attention of the surrounding executives, but loud enough to ensure his lawyers heard every word. I hired a private investigator the morning after I dropped you off. It took him less than 48 hours to track your location. I must admit I am surprised to find you sitting in a place like this. I expected my investigator to find you crying in a cheap motel. Jason took a step back, his eyes dragging up and down my body. I was wearing a stunning custom-tailored white silk blouse and a charcoal blazer provided by Beatrice's personal estate stylists. The outfit easily cost more than a reliable used car. Jason scoffed, a harsh sound of pure disbelief escaping his throat. He shook his head, looking at his lawyers as if sharing a private joke. A hidden credit card, he stated, crossing his arms over his chest. That is the only explanation. I canceled your primary accounts, but you must have had a backup card stashed away for emergencies. And instead of using it to secure an apartment or buy groceries, you immediately maxed it out on designer clothes and expensive coffee just to sit in the financial district and pretend you still belong in my world. You are pathetic, Stella. You are playing dress up with money you cannot afford to pay back. I did not correct him. I let him revel in his wildly inaccurate assumptions. I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands comfortably in my lap. What do you want, Jason? I asked, my voice completely devoid of the fear or desperation he so clearly expected to hear. Jason snapped his fingers. The lawyer standing to his right immediately stepped forward. He unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, intimidating manila folder. He dropped it directly onto the center of my table with a loud, aggressive slap. Those are unilateral divorce papers, Jason announced, a cruel smile stretching across his face. I had my legal team expedite the drafting process. I am officially cutting you out of my life, Stella, and I am doing it today. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents, then back up at him. I maintained absolute silence, letting him fill the quiet space with his own arrogance. Here is how this is going to work, Jason continued, leaning forward again, his eyes narrowing with a predatory gleam. You are going to open that folder, take a pen and sign your name on the dotted line. You are going to legally relinquish any and all claims to Vanguard Logistics. You will waive your right to spousal support. You will waive your right to our previous joint assets, and you will walk away from this marriage with exactly what you brought into it. Nothing. And if I refuse to sign, I asked coldly. Jason laughed. It was a dark, menacing sound. He placed both hands flat on the table and lowered his face until he was inches from mine. If you refuse to sign, if you try to drag this into a courtroom and fight me for a single cent of my company, I will utterly destroy you, Stella. I will not just fight you. I will bury you alive in endless litigation. You think you know how my finances work, but you have no idea what I have built. Amber's husband, DeAndre, controls a massive network of real estate shell companies. He is a brilliant frontman. I have integrated those companies directly into my corporate legal structure. If you try to challenge this divorce, my lawyers will use DeAndre's network to generate an endless maze of corporate lawsuits against you. Jason pointed a finger directly at my face, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. We will drag you into depositions for years. We will drain whatever hidden credit limits you have left. We will drown you in legal fees until you are completely bankrupt. And when you cannot afford to pay your attorneys anymore, I will seize whatever remaining personal assets you have just to cover my own court costs. You will be sleeping on the streets begging for spare change. I hold all the power. Stella, you are a discarded liability. Sign away the company right now, or I swear I will make you regret the day you ever met me. I sat perfectly still, listening to the man I had spent 7 years supporting outline his elaborate plan to ruin my life. He thought his threats were terrifying. He thought he was backing me into an inescapable corner. He had absolutely no idea what he had just done. By explicitly detailing his strategy to use DeAndre's real estate shell companies as a legal weapon, Jason had just verbally confirmed the existence of his entire money laundering network in front of multiple witnesses. He was handing me the exact ammunition I needed to execute the federal traps I had laid. I looked at the thick stack of unilateral divorce papers resting on the marble table. I looked at the aggressive corporate lawyers standing behind him, ready to initiate a brutal legal war. And finally, I looked directly into Jason's eyes, seeing nothing but the hollow, greedy void of a man who believed he was a god. He wanted me to surrender. He wanted me to sign away my rights to Vanguard Logistics to save myself from his wrath. I slowly reached into my designer handbag, my fingers closing around the cool metal of my gold pen. The hunt had escalated, and Jason had just handed me the weapon to deliver the fatal blow. I pulled the heavy gold pen from my bag, letting the smooth metal rest between my fingers. Jason stood over me, his chest puffed out, breathing heavily with the adrenaline of his own perceived dominance. His two corporate litigators shifted their weight, their hands hovering near their briefcases, fully expecting me to throw a glass of water, scream, or burst into desperate tears. They were entirely prepared for a hysterical wife. They were not prepared for a predator. Without a single word, I flipped open the thick manila folder. The unilateral divorce decree was dense, packed with aggressive legal jargon designed to intimidate. It stated that I relinquished all marital claims to Vanguard Logistics. It explicitly stripped me of any right to spousal support division of future assets or access to the intellectual property I had personally coded. It was a brutal, one-sided slaughter of a contract. I did not flinch. I pressed the nib of my pen to the crisp white paper and signed my name on the first dotted line. Jason blinked, the arrogant smirk freezing on his face. He watched in total silence as I flipped to the second page and signed again. The sharp, rhythmic scratching of my pen against the paper was the only sound at our table. I turned to the third page, initialed "The Waiver of Spousal Support," and finally signed the heavily bolded section surrendering my equity in his logistics company. I closed the folder, tapped it once on the marble table to align the edges, and slid it directly across to him. "I am done," I said. My voice was as calm and clear as glass. "You have your company, Jason. You have your freedom." For a fraction of a second, Jason looked genuinely disoriented. He had armed himself for a brutal legal war. He had brought highly paid mercenaries to a coffee shop to crush my spirit. Seeing me capitulate in less than 30 seconds short-circuited his brain. But his confusion vanished almost instantly, replaced by a surge of intoxicating, blinding ego. He snatched the folder off the table, holding it up like a championship trophy. He let out a loud, booming laugh that caused several nearby executives to turn their heads. "I knew it!" Jason gloated, his voice dripping with absolute triumph. "I knew you would fold. You always were weak when someone finally backed you into a corner. You talk a big game about your contributions, Stella, but the second you face real power, you roll over and surrender. You just signed away half of a $50 million enterprise for absolutely nothing." He turned to his lawyers, slapping one of them on the shoulder. "File this immediately. I want the judge's signature on it before the end of the day. I want this dead weight officially cut from my life." The lawyers nodded, taking the folder and securing it back inside their briefcases. They looked at me with a mixture of professional indifference and mild pity. They thought they had just witnessed a broken woman give up the fight of her life. "Enjoy your expensive coffee," Stella, Jason sneered, leaning down one last time. "Because once that card declines, you will be back to drinking tap water. Do not ever try to cross me again." He turned his back on me and strode out of the coffee lounge, his lawyers trailing closely behind him. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the Seattle streets, walking with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he was utterly invincible. I watched him go. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. A cold, triumphant smile spread across my face. Jason was a master of manipulation, but he was completely ignorant of United States federal law. His obsession with protecting his company and securing his $50 million venture capital payout had entirely blinded him to the legal reality of the criminal justice system. He thought the divorce papers were his ultimate shield. He had no idea they were actually his death warrant. In the United States, federal courts recognize a powerful legal concept known as spousal testimonial privilege. It prevents the government from compelling a person to testify against their current husband or wife in a criminal trial. It is a formidable shield that protects corrupt spouses from being exposed by the people closest to them. As long as Jason and I remained legally married, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission would face massive legal hurdles attempting to use my insider knowledge against him. Any aggressive defense attorney could file injunctions to block my testimony claiming marital privilege. By forcing a rapid unilateral divorce, Jason had just voluntarily destroyed that shield. He had been in such a frantic rush to cut me out of his corporate equity that he legally severed our marital bond. The very moment a judge stamped those papers, I was no longer his wife. I was simply a private citizen, a third-party witness, unburdened by any marital legal blocks. I was now legally free to hand over every single piece of internal evidence I possessed directly to the federal authorities. And I possessed everything. Jason thought he had locked me out of his life, but he forgot that I built the digital infrastructure of his company. I still had the encrypted backups of his original financial ledgers. I had the digital footprints proving he transferred our joint marital assets into an offshore account registered to Siena. I had the metadata proving he erased my name from the patent filings for the supply chain algorithm. Most importantly, thanks to his arrogant rant. Just moments ago, I now had his verbal confirmation regarding DeAndre's involvement. Jason had explicitly stated that DeAndre, his own brother-in-law, managed a network of real estate shell companies designed to hide stolen wealth. Jason believed I signed away my power. In reality, I had just unlocked my ultimate weapon. I did not need a claim to his company shares anymore because his company was about to be seized by the federal government. The $50 million venture capital payout he was so desperately chasing would never materialize. Instead, the bridge loan he just accepted from Kensington Holdings would serve as the final piece of evidence. The forensic audit clause, hidden in that loan agreement, gave me the legal authority to expose his money laundering operation from the inside. I set my coffee cup down on the marble table. I opened my secure tablet, logging into the encrypted Kensington Holdings executive network. I opened a new highly classified digital file and began compiling the evidence. I attached the original source code for the supply chain algorithm, the offshore bank routing numbers, and the preliminary data linking DeAndre to the fraudulent real estate purchases. I was going to package Jason's entire criminal existence into a single devastating digital dossier. When the time was right, I would not need to hire aggressive corporate lawyers to fight him in civil court. I would simply forward the dossier to the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. Jason wanted a lesson in survival. I was going to give him a masterclass in total destruction. The moment the ink dried on the judge's signature, officially stamping my divorce decree into public record, my invisible chains shattered. I was no longer Jason's wife. I was his executioner. I walked out of the coffee lounge and stepped directly into the waiting Maybach, leaving the financial district behind. I did not celebrate. I did not take a moment to breathe. I rode in absolute silence back to the Kensington estate, my mind already locking onto the next phase of the operation. Beatrice was waiting for me inside the soundproof vault of her private office. She sat perfectly still behind her massive mahogany desk, her hands folded over the silver handle of her cane. She heard the heavy doors seal shut behind me and tilted her head. "It is done," I announced, taking my seat at the executive terminal. "The unilateral divorce is finalized. Spousal testimonial privilege is officially dissolved. I am legally cleared to act as a hostile witness." Beatrice smiled a dark and deeply satisfied expression. "Then we stop playing defense," she commanded. "Trigger the audit clause. Tear his empire down to the studs." I turned to my glowing monitor and accessed the Kensington Holdings investment portal. Jason had signed the term sheet for the $2 million bridge loan. Buried deep within the covenants of that loan was a mandatory unannounced compliance review. By accepting our capital to keep his supply chain operational, he had unwittingly handed Kensington Holdings the digital master keys to his entire corporate infrastructure. I executed a command override, bypassing Vanguard Logistics' external firewalls and plunging directly into their raw, unfiltered financial ledgers. Data flooded my screens in a relentless digital waterfall. Spreadsheets, wire transfers, payroll manifests, and offshore routing numbers populated before my eyes. To an untrained auditor, the books looked remarkably clean. Sienna had clearly spent hours scrubbing the surface-level accounts, manufacturing a facade of aggressive but legitimate corporate growth. She had balanced the primary ledgers, disguised the missing operational cash as aggressive marketing expenditures, and buried their liabilities under layers of projected future revenue. It was a decent effort for a mid-level operations manager. But it was incredibly sloppy for anyone facing a forensic financial analyst who had built the very software they were trying to manipulate. I bypassed the primary ledgers entirely and dove straight into the accounts payable routing histories. I knew Jason. I knew his arrogance, and I knew his profound lack of discipline. He would never have the patience to build a complex, untraceable laundering matrix. He would take the path of least resistance. It took me less than 40 minutes to find the gaping hole in their financial armor. I isolated a recurring expenditure listed under Vanguard Logistics International Vendor Payments. Every month, massive sums of investor capital were being wired to a third-party logistics consulting firm called Apex Horizon Solutions. On paper, Apex Horizon was billing Vanguard for advanced supply chain routing optimization. But I had written the routing optimization algorithm myself. Vanguard did not need third-party consultants. I ran a background trace on Apex Horizon Solutions. It was a ghost. There was no physical corporate headquarters, no registered employee manifest, and no legitimate digital footprint. It was a hollow shell company registered to a blind post office box in Delaware. Jason was bleeding his own company dry, classifying the theft as a legitimate business expense, and writing off the stolen investor capital on his corporate tax returns. I followed the money. I tracked the outbound wire transfers from the Delaware shell company, watching the stolen capital splinter into dozens of smaller, supposedly untraceable offshore accounts. But money always leaves a trail, especially when the people spending it are addicted to luxury. I pulled the transaction receipts connected to the offshore routing numbers. The sheer volume of their theft was staggering. Jason was not just skimming off the top to cover a lavish lifestyle. He was actively looting the company. I found purchase orders for a fleet of imported luxury sports cars. I found a massive wire transfer used to secure an all-cash purchase of a $3 million penthouse suite in downtown Seattle deeded explicitly to Sienna. I was using the money meant to pay his hardworking developers to buy his mistress the high society life she so desperately craved. But the cars and the penthouse were just the tip of the iceberg. The most massive drain on Vanguard's capital was tied to high-yield residential real estate investments. Millions of dollars were being systematically funneled into acquiring luxury properties across the Pacific Northwest. I narrowed my focus, launching a deep dive into the county property deeds and title transfers. Jason was arrogant, but he was not stupid enough to put his own name on stolen real estate. He needed a proxy. He needed someone blindly loyal, utterly greedy, and foolish enough to sign federal documents without reading the fine print. He needed a straw buyer. I cracked the final layer of the LLC ownership structures. The digital documents materialized on my screen, displaying the certified signatures on the property deeds and the corresponding federal tax filings. I stared at the glowing monitor, a cold, ruthless satisfaction washing over me. The primary registered agent for the entire real estate laundering network was DeAndre, Amber's husband. The same man who had sent me a laughing meme and told me to sleep under a bridge was currently acting as the illegal frontman for a massive corporate embezzlement ring. I pulled up the corporate officer filings. Amber was listed right beside him as an executive consulting director, pulling a massive, completely fraudulent salary directly from the stolen investor funds. Jason had used his own sister and brother-in-law to clean his dirty money. DeAndre had eagerly signed his name to dozens of fraudulent tax documents, falsely claiming the luxury properties as legitimate investments acquired through his own non-existent real estate genius. Amber was happily spending the embezzled salaries to fund her lavish, entitled lifestyle. They thought they were brilliant investors. They thought they had finally outsmarted the system. In reality, they were committing multiple counts of federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. By signing those federal tax returns, DeAndre and Amber had placed themselves directly in the crosshairs of the Internal Revenue Service and the FBI. They had laughed at me while I stood freezing in the rain. They had mocked my devastation and told me I deserved to be homeless. Now they were living in mansions purchased with stolen capital, completely unaware that I held the undisputed evidence of their federal crimes. I compiled the deeds, the fake invoices, the offshore routing numbers, and DeAndre's fraudulent tax returns into a highly encrypted master evidence file. I had systematically mapped every single artery of Jason's criminal network. The shadow audit was complete. Vanguard Logistics was not a technology company anymore. It was a massive, fragile house of cards built entirely on federal felonies, and I was holding the match. Beatrice listened to the furious, rhythmic clicking of my keyboard come to a halt. She turned her head toward me, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "You found the bodies," Beatrice stated, her voice echoing with dark anticipation. "I found the entire graveyard," I replied, my eyes locked on the undeniable proof of their impending destruction. "Jason is embezzling millions through a network of shell companies. His mistress holds the stolen assets. His sister and brother-in-law are signing the fraudulent tax returns. Every single one of them is going to federal prison." I locked the encrypted file and secured it within the Kensington mainframe. The evidence was bulletproof. Now it was time to cut off their air supply. It was time to systematically choke Jason's company to death and watch them tear each other apart in the dark. I picked up the encrypted landline on my desk. Beatrice had granted me unrestricted clearance to communicate with Kensington Holdings' elite banking partners. These were the institutional titans who managed the physical flow of our venture capital. I did not need to introduce myself by name. My security clearance code was enough to instantly command the attention of the senior vice presidents of corporate risk management at 3 different global banks. My first call was to Pacific Republic Bank, the institution currently holding Jason's operational accounts. I informed their compliance director that Kensington Holdings had flagged severe irregularities in the recent bridge loan dispersal to Vanguard Logistics. I cited potential violations of the Bank Secrecy Act and directed them to look closely at the routing numbers associated with Apex Horizon Solutions. The response was immediate. The bank's automated risk protocols were triggered while I was still on the line. My second call was to the Commercial Lending Division of Horizon Trust, the bank managing Vanguard's payroll and vendor disbursements. I provided them with a highly redacted version of DeAndre's fraudulent tax filings, just enough to spark a mandatory internal review. Banks despise federal scrutiny. The mere hint of a federal tax investigation sends their compliance departments into a ruthless panic. My third call was to the underwriting team at Cascade Financial, the firm backing Jason's corporate credit lines. I invoked a material adverse change clause based on our preliminary due diligence. I ordered a complete and total freeze on all outgoing capital. 3 phone calls, less than 15 minutes of my time. I placed the receiver back on the cradle and folded my hands on the glass desk. The financial guillotine was primed. Exactly 24 hours later, the financial strangulation took effect. I sat in the soundproof vault of my office, a cup of black coffee steaming beside my keyboard. I watched the live telemetry of Vanguard Logistics banking infrastructure through my monitor. It was a Friday morning, payroll day. At precisely 8 o'clock, Vanguard's automated accounting software attempted to execute the biweekly direct deposits for 300 employees. The digital request hit the Pacific Republic Bank servers and violently bounced back. Code read, insufficient funds. Account frozen pending compliance review. A slow, cold smile crept across my face. I watched the digital rejections stack up on my screen like a cascading avalanche of failure. Every single employee, from the junior software developers to the warehouse managers, woke up to empty bank accounts. 10 minutes later, the automated vendor payments tried to process. Vanguard owed massive weekly disbursements to independent freight operators, warehouse leasing agents, and commercial insurance brokers. Every single transaction was blocked. The accounts were paralyzed. Jason's company was officially starving to death. The financial freeze immediately triggered a catastrophic physical collapse. A logistics company cannot survive for a single hour without liquid capital. By 10 in the morning, the corporate fuel cards distributed to Vanguard's fleet of long-haul truck drivers were declined at gas stations across the Pacific Northwest. Without fuel, the trucks could not move. Freight stopped dead in transit. Perishable goods sat rotting in idling trailers. Furious truck drivers, realizing their paychecks had bounced and their fuel cards were worthless, abandoned their routes. They parked their massive rigs on the shoulders of highways and walked away. The supply chain, the very heartbeat of Jason's entire enterprise, flatlined. Warehouse managers locked their loading docks, refusing to release or accept any new inventory until their outstanding invoices were settled in cash. The highly advanced optimization algorithm Jason had stolen from me was completely useless. You cannot optimize a shipping route for a truck that has no gas and a driver who refuses to work for free. The entire operational grid turned red. The company was bleeding out on the operating table, and I had hidden all the tourniquets. 10 miles away, the Vanguard Logistics penthouse was consumed by absolute, unadulterated terror. Jason stood in the center of the executive suite, his face purple with rage. The polished facade of the arrogant tech CEO had completely shattered. He hurled a heavy crystal paperweight across the room. It smashed against the wall, raining glass shards over the imported Italian leather sofas. He screamed at his chief financial officer, a terrified man who was frantically slamming his fingers against a laptop keyboard. Jason demanded to know why his corporate dashboard was flashing with critical banking errors. He demanded to know why his phone was exploding with furious calls from vendors threatening immediate lawsuits. The CFO stammered, sweat pouring down his face. He explained that all three of their banking partners had simultaneously locked their accounts. He read the automated bank notices aloud, his voice shaking. Irregularities in compliance. Potential violations of federal banking regulations. Mandatory asset freeze. Jason grabbed the CFO by the collar of his expensive suit, hauling him out of his chair. He roared at the man, demanding to know who authorized the freeze. He screamed that they had just secured a $2 million bridge loan from Kensington Holdings, that their accounts should be flush with cash. Sienna burst into the office, her perfectly styled hair disheveled, her designer heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. She was clutching a tablet, her eyes wide with sheer panic. She told Jason that the warehouse operators were holding their freight hostage. She reported that the customer service lines were flooded with angry clients demanding to know why their international shipments had vanished from the tracking grids. Jason released the CFO, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of pure desperation. He paced the length of the office like a caged animal. He ordered Sienna to get the banking executives on the phone immediately. He ordered the CFO to wire emergency funds from their offshore accounts to cover the domestic payroll. But the CFO shook his head, his face pale and defeated. He told Jason that the offshore accounts were blocked, the international wire transfers were flagged by the corresponding banks. Every single financial exit route was sealed shut. Jason stood in the center of his collapsing empire, his chest heaving. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of power and control. He thought he was the smartest man in Seattle. He thought he had outwitted me, outsmarted the tax agencies, and secured his path to the billionaire bracket. He looked at Sienna, his eyes wide with a sudden creeping realization. Someone was deliberately destroying them. They were completely surrounded, and they had absolutely no idea who was tightening the noose. The realization that they were under a targeted attack sent Jason into a manic spiral. He lunged across his massive mahogany desk, his hands shaking so violently he knocked a crystal pen holder to the floor. There was only one entity powerful enough to freeze his accounts and choke his global supply chain simultaneously: Kensington Holdings, the very people who had just handed him a $2 million bridge loan. He needed to reach the associate director he had bribed to fast-track his application. He needed to stop the financial bleeding before the venture capital firm realized his entire company was a hollow shell built on stolen code. Jason dialed the private, unlisted line of his inside contact. The automated, sterile voice of the Kensington corporate switchboard responded, informing him that the number was disconnected. He slammed the receiver down, a curse tearing from his throat. He opened his laptop and began firing off frantic emails to every Kensington executive address he could find in his directory. He pleaded for an emergency meeting. He cited a catastrophic banking glitch that required immediate high-level intervention to protect their pending $50 million investment. Every single email bounced back within seconds. The screen flashed with a series of cold red automated rejection notices. His digital access to the Kensington investor portal, the gateway to his billionaire dreams, had been permanently and aggressively revoked. Sweating and utterly desperate, Jason turned to Sienna. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her slightly. He ordered her to march directly into the Kensington high-rise in downtown Seattle. He told her to use every ounce of her charm, manipulation, and aggressive negotiation tactics to secure an audience with the compliance board. Sienna hesitated. The smug arrogance that usually defined her features was entirely replaced by raw, suffocating fear. The threat of federal prison and absolute bankruptcy, however, pushed her out the penthouse door. I sat in my elevated, glass-walled office at the Kensington downtown headquarters, sipping a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. My secure monitor displayed a high-definition live feed from the building's main lobby cameras. I watched Sienna stride through the revolving glass doors, wearing a designer trench coat and a pair of oversized sunglasses to hide her panic. She marched straight up to the marble reception desk, slamming her hand flat on the polished stone. Even without audio, her aggressive body language spoke volumes. She was demanding to speak with the Director of Strategic Acquisitions. She was shouting that she was the Vice President of Vanguard Logistics and required immediate corporate assistance from the highest level of the firm. The receptionist, following my explicit and pre-written security protocols, remained perfectly impassive. I pressed the intercom button on my desk, connecting directly to the head of building security. I gave a single calm directive: remove the trespasser from the premises immediately. On my screen, I watched 4 heavily armed private security guards converge on Sienna. They did not politely ask her to leave. They simply flanked her, stepping into her personal space with intimidating, highly coordinated precision. Sienna shrieked, pointing her finger at the guards, undoubtedly threatening to sue the firm and ruin their careers. Her voice was completely muffled by the thick acoustic glass isolating my executive suite. A security guard pointed sharply toward the exit. When Sienna stubbornly refused to move, 2 guards firmly gripped her upper arms. They lifted her polished designer heels completely off the marble floor. They physically carried her out the heavy glass doors and deposited her roughly onto the rain-slicked sidewalk. I zoomed the camera in just enough to see her standing on the street, her perfect hair ruined by the wind, furiously typing on her phone to tell Jason they had been completely and physically shut out of their only lifeline. While Jason and Sienna were desperately beating their hands against the impenetrable walls of Kensington Holdings, I turned my attention to the second front of my financial war: the real estate shell companies. It was time to introduce DeAndre to the brutal, unforgiving reality of federal tax evasion. I opened a highly secure encrypted communication channel directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I did not send a vague, anonymous tip. I sent a devastating, meticulously organized data packet. I included DeAndre's forged signatures on the shell company tax filings, the exact routing numbers moving stolen investor capital into his personal bank accounts, and the property deeds for the luxury homes he had illegally purchased to hide Jason's embezzled wealth. I flagged the digital file with an urgent priority code reserved specifically for massive corporate embezzlement and syndicate fraud. Across the city, DeAndre was fast asleep in the master bedroom of his sprawling $3 million suburban mansion. It was a mansion paid for entirely by the money Jason had stolen from me. At exactly 6 in the morning, a loud, aggressive pounding echoed through the quiet house. DeAndre woke up groggy and irritated, expecting a misdirected delivery driver or a neighborhood solicitor. He threw on a silk robe and shuffled down the grand, sweeping staircase, grumbling under his breath. He swung the heavy oak front door open, ready to yell at whoever was disturbing his peace. There was no one standing on his porch, but taped directly to the center of his custom wood door was a thick, unmistakable federal envelope. The bold blue seal of the Internal Revenue Service glared back at him in the morning light. DeAndre tore the envelope open, his heart suddenly hammering violently against his ribs. The document inside was a formal notice of audit and criminal investigation. The letter explicitly listed the exact names of the 4 Delaware shell companies he had registered for Jason. It demanded the immediate, unredacted surrender of all financial ledgers, bank statements, and communication records for the past 3 fiscal years. It cited potential severe charges of felony tax fraud and money laundering. DeAndre dropped the paper onto the marble entryway. His charismatic, easygoing facade vanished in a single instant, replaced by sheer, blinding terror. He rushed back inside, grabbing his smartphone with trembling hands. He dialed Amber, who had left early for a luxury spa day, screaming into the receiver that the federal government had found their hidden accounts. He then dialed Jason, leaving a frantic, hyperventilating voicemail demanding immediate legal protection. DeAndre realized in a moment of pure, suffocating dread that Jason had used him as a human shield. If the federal auditors dragged him into an interrogation room, he would be facing decades behind bars, while Jason hid behind his expensive corporate lawyers. The walls were closing in rapidly on every single person who had laughed at my demise. Their stolen wealth was disintegrating. Their freedom was hanging by a frayed thread. I watched the global financial markets open on my monitors, a cold, triumphant executioner standing perfectly still in the center of the slaughter. The heavy glass doors of the Vanguard Logistics penthouse flew open with a violent crash. DeAndre did not wait for the receptionist to announce him. He bypassed the empty security desk, his face tight with a terrifying, desperate rage. He stormed directly into Jason's executive office, completely ignoring the panicked chief financial officer, who was currently packing his personal belongings into a cardboard box. Jason looked up from his dead computer monitors, his eyes bloodshot from a lack of sleep and the crushing weight of his frozen supply chain. DeAndre marched straight to the mahogany desk and slammed the crumpled federal envelope onto the glass surface. The blue seal of the Internal Revenue Service glared in the harsh overhead lighting. "Fix this!" DeAndre roared, his voice shaking the expensive artwork on the walls. "Fix this right now, Jason. They are auditing every single shell company you made me sign for. They want 3 years of ledgers by Monday morning." Jason stared at the federal document, the last remnants of color draining from his face. He reached out with trembling fingers, scanning the bold text demanding unredacted financial records. He tried to put on his usual mask of arrogant control, but his voice cracked under the intense pressure. "Calm down, DeAndre," Jason stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "It is just a routine compliance check. My corporate lawyers will handle it. We will stall them with endless paperwork until the venture capital funding clears our accounts." "Do not play me for a fool!" DeAndre shouted, slamming his fist onto the desk. "This is a criminal investigation notice. They are looking at felony tax evasion and wire fraud. You told me those real estate holding companies were completely legal tax shelters. You promised me zero risk. I am the registered agent. My signature is on every single fraudulent federal filing. If the FBI raids my house, I am looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary while you hide behind your corporate immunity. I will not go down for your stolen money. If I get dragged into an interrogation room, I swear I will hand them your head on a silver platter." Before Jason could formulate another lie to pacify his brother-in-law, the office doors swung open again. Amber marched into the room. She was still wearing a plush bathrobe from her luxury spa day, but her face was twisted into an ugly mask of panic and fury. Her credit cards had been declined at the resort, and DeAndre had called her in a hyperventilating panic about the IRS. Amber completely ignored Jason and zeroed in on Sienna, who was cowering near the corner of the office. Amber lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at the mistress. "This is your fault!" Amber screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You brought this curse into our family. Everything was perfectly fine when Stella was here managing the finances. We had money. We had stability. But you had to sink your claws into my brother and demand luxury penthouses and offshore accounts. You drained the company dry to fund your pathetic high society fantasies, and now the federal government is coming to seize my home. You are nothing but a cheap gold digger who ruined our entire lives." Sienna bristled, her fear suddenly igniting into vicious defensive rage. She stepped forward, squaring off against Amber. "Do not you dare act innocent, Amber." Sienna spat back, her voice dripping with venom. "You gladly spent every single stolen dollar Jason handed you. You bought designer bags and took luxury vacations using the exact same embezzled funds that bought my penthouse. You are just as guilty as the rest of us. The only difference is that you are too stupid to realize we are all standing on the same sinking ship." Jason slammed both hands onto his desk, the sound echoing sharply through the chaotic office. "Shut up," he roared, his voice hoarse. "Screaming at each other will not unfreeze our bank accounts or stop the IRS. We need cash. We need the $50 million payout from Kensington Holdings right now, or we are all going to federal prison." DeAndre scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "They blocked your emails, Jason. They threw Sienna out onto the street. They are ghosting you, and we are completely out of time. The game is over." Sienna stood perfectly still in the center of the room. Her eyes darted wildly across the floor, her mind desperately racing for a lifeline. She looked at Jason, then at Amber, and finally at the panoramic window overlooking the glittering Seattle skyline. Her survival instinct kicked into absolute overdrive. "The game is not over," Sienna said, her voice dropping into a cold, calculated tone that commanded immediate attention. "They are ignoring our emails and blocking our calls because it is easy to ghost someone from behind a secure corporate firewall, but they cannot ghost us if we corner them in public." Jason stared at her, utterly desperate for a solution. "What are you talking about?" "We host a gala," Sienna stated, pacing the length of the office as the strategy rapidly formed in her mind. "A massive high society charity gala right here in downtown Seattle. we use the absolute last drops of our hidden emergency cash reserves to rent the grand ballroom at the Four Seasons. We invite the local media, the most prominent tech journalists, and every major player in the Pacific Northwest financial sector. Amber rolled her eyes, throwing her hands up in exasperation. We are facing federal indictments and bankruptcy, and your brilliant solution is to throw a party. It is not a party, Amber. It is an ambush, Sienna snapped. We send a highly public, undeniably high-profile invitation directly to the executive board of Kensington Holdings. They are desperate to maintain their reputation as the dominant venture capital firm on the West Coast. If we frame the gala as a celebration of our new operational partnership with them, they will be forced to send a representative to avoid a massive public relations disaster. When they arrive, we trap them in a room full of reporters and industry peers. We leverage the media presence to force a public confirmation of the $50 million investment. We shame them into handing over the check. Jason stared at Sienna, his eyes wide as the sheer audacity of the plan washed over him. It was a desperate, reckless Hail Mary. It was financial suicide if it failed. But looking at the federal audit notice resting on his desk and the frozen bank accounts glaring from his monitors, he knew they had absolutely no other options. They were bleeding to death, and this was the last remaining tourniquet. "Do it!" Jason ordered, his voice laced with manic, desperate resolve. "Book the Four Seasons. Send the invitations to every media outlet in the city. Put Kensington Holdings in a spotlight so bright they cannot possibly ignore us. We are going to force their hand, and we are going to walk out of that ballroom with our $50 million. 72 hours later, a courier carrying a silver platter stepped out of the private elevator leading to the executive floor of Kensington Holdings. On the platter rested a thick, heavy envelope crafted from matte black cardstock and sealed with an oversized wax stamp bearing the Vanguard Logistics logo. The courier handed it to the armed security detail, who scanned it for biological and chemical threats, before passing it through the heavy vault doors into Beatrice's private office. Beatrice sat perfectly still at her mahogany desk. She ran her fingertips lightly over the wax seal, her heightened tactile senses immediately identifying the ostentatious expense of the paper. She broke the seal and pulled out the invitation. Because of her blindness, she simply slid the heavy cardstock across the glass surface toward me. "Read it aloud," Beatrice commanded, resting her hands on her silver-handled cane. "Let us hear how a dying rat squeaks." I picked up the invitation. The edges were dipped in genuine gold leaf. The arrogance radiated from the physical object itself. It was the mark of a desperate man spending his last stolen dollars to project an illusion of untouchable wealth. Vanguard Logistics cordially invites the executive board of Kensington Holdings to the Vanguard Innovation Gala. I read, keeping my voice perfectly flat. An exclusive evening at the Four Seasons Hotel to celebrate our groundbreaking supply chain technology and our upcoming highly anticipated strategic partnership with Seattle's premier venture capital firm. Press attendance is strictly enforced. Beatrice let out a dry, rattling laugh that echoed off the soundproof walls. It was a sound entirely devoid of any humor. "Hi is trying to corner us," Beatrice stated, tapping her cane on the floor. "He thinks if he fills a ballroom with aggressive tech journalists and high society sycophants, he can publicly shame Kensington Holdings into handing over a $50 million check. He believes the media pressure will force us to finalize the Series C funding to avoid a public relations scandal." I tossed the gold leaf invitation onto the desk. "It is a suicide mission," I replied. "He is trapping himself in a room with only one exit, and he is inviting the local media to watch him burn." Beatrice tilted her head toward me. "Are we going to attend his little party, Stella?" "We are going to give him the performance of a lifetime," I confirmed. "But we are not bringing a $50 million check. We are bringing the federal government." With Beatrice's absolute authorization, I immediately initiated the final phase of the operation. I left the vault and walked down the executive corridor to a highly secured boardroom reserved for Kensington's elite legal team. I summoned my lead corporate litigator, a ruthless and brilliant attorney named Harrison, who specialized exclusively in white-collar federal prosecution and hostile corporate takeovers. Harrison sat at the head of the long conference table flanked by 3 junior associates. I bypassed the pleasantries and projected my encrypted shadow audit onto the massive digital display screen at the front of the room. I walked the legal team through every single artery of Jason's criminal network. I showed them the offshore routing numbers, siphoning operational cash to Sienna's real estate purchases. I presented the metadata, proving Jason had illegally wiped my name from the patent filings of the supply chain algorithm. Finally, I displayed the irrefutable evidence of DeAndre's signature on the fraudulent federal tax returns for the dummy shell companies. Harrison scrutinized the data with the sharp predatory focus of a seasoned legal sniper. He did not ask if the evidence was real. He only cared if it was legally bulletproof under the strict guidelines of the United States federal court system. "This is a masterclass in federal wire fraud and aggressive tax evasion," Harrison stated, adjusting his glasses as he read the offshore ledger routing codes. "The corporate veil is completely pierced. There is zero plausible deniability for the CEO, the vice president of operations, or the registered agent of these shell companies. If we hand this to the federal authorities, they will not just issue fines. They will pursue maximum sentencing under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Package it, I ordered. I want every document, every digital footprint, and every fraudulent signature compiled into a single undeniable digital dossier." While Harrison's team frantically compiled the legal framework, I returned to my executive suite. It was time to make the most important phone call of my entire life. I picked up the encrypted landline and bypassed standard government switchboards, utilizing a highly classified direct contact number provided by Beatrice. I dialed the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission for the Pacific Northwest Division. The regional director was a notoriously aggressive regulator who had built his entire career on dismantling corrupt tech startups. He answered on the second ring. I did not introduce myself by my previous name. I introduced myself as the Director of Strategic Acquisitions for Kensington Holdings. The sheer weight of the firm's name commanded his absolute undivided attention. I informed the director that Kensington Holdings had uncovered a massive multi-million-dollar fraud syndicate, operating under the guise of a local logistics startup. I explained that the CEO was actively attempting to defraud our venture capital firm out of $50 million using stolen intellectual property and illegally inflated revenue projections. The director's tone immediately shifted from professional curiosity to intense focused hostility towards the criminals. The SEC does not tolerate corporate embezzlement, especially when it threatens to destabilize the regional investment market. I have the unredacted ledgers, I told the director, my voice echoing coldly in my office. I have the offshore banking routes, and I have the fraudulent tax filings signed by the straw buyers. I am transmitting the entire encrypted dossier to your secure federal server right now. I pressed the Enter key on my keyboard. A progress bar flashed across my screen, rapidly filling with green as the devastating data packet launched through the secure federal firewall. I also informed the director about Jason's desperate charity gala at the Four Seasons Hotel. I provided the exact date, time, and location. I explained that the CEO, his complicit executives, and the front man for his illegal shell companies would all be gathered in one highly publicized room, actively attempting to solicit fraudulent investments across state lines. The regional director confirmed receipt of the dossier. He assured me that his elite task force would immediately verify the financial data. If the evidence was as airtight as I claimed, he promised that the SEC would coordinate directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to execute a coordinated high-impact strike. I hung up the phone. The trap was no longer just set. The jaws were locked and loaded. Jason had wanted a high-society event filled with flashing cameras and wealthy investors. He had wanted to publicly force my firm into handing him a fortune. He was about to get exactly what he asked for. He was going to be the absolute center of attention. The night of the gala arrived, blanketing downtown Seattle. In a crisp, unforgiving chill, the Four Seasons Hotel had been transformed into a temple of desperate extravagance. Jason had spared absolutely no expense, draining the last drops of his stolen operational capital to manufacture an illusion of unshakable prosperity. Massive floral arrangements cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, and towering ice sculptures flanked the grand ballroom doors. Waitstaff carried silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne, weaving through a crowd composed of the city's most elite tech journalists, aggressive venture capitalists, and high society socialites. The media presence was suffocating. Camera flashes illuminated the opulent lobby like strobe lights, capturing the faces of the wealthy and powerful. Standing near the velvet ropes at the primary entrance, Jason, Sienna, Amber, and DeAndre formed a tight defensive circle. They were dressed in immaculate designer formal wear, projecting a carefully rehearsed facade of extreme confidence. But to my highly trained eye, observing from the tinted windows of my approaching vehicle, their terror was brilliantly obvious. Jason kept checking his diamond watch, his jaw clenching with mounting anxiety. His eyes darted toward the entrance every time a new luxury vehicle pulled up to the valet stand. He was waiting for the executives of Kensington Holdings. He was waiting for his salvation. Sienna stood beside him, her smile brittle and strained, clutching a champagne flute so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Amber and DeAndre tried to look relaxed, but DeAndre was sweating profusely in his custom tuxedo, his eyes constantly scanning the room as if expecting the federal authorities to drop from the ceiling at any second. They were entirely trapped in their own lie, surrounded by the very people they were attempting to defraud. At precisely 8 o'clock, my black armored Maybach glided smoothly to the front of the hotel. The valet attendants immediately scrambled backward, recognizing the vehicle of an absolute apex predator. The heavy passenger door swung open. The blinding flash of local press cameras erupted the second my stilettos touched the red carpet. I stepped out of the vehicle, inhaling the sharp night air. I was not wearing a generic department store dress. Beatrice's personal stylists had outfitted me in a breathtaking custom-tailored evening gown crafted from deep emerald silk. The fabric moved like liquid glass, wrapping tightly around my frame and pooling elegantly at my feet. A single string of flawless conflict-free diamonds rested against my collarbone. I did not look like a discarded broken ex-wife. I looked like absolute, terrifying power. I walked up the marble steps of the hotel with the steady, measured pace of an executioner ascending the gallows. The sudden commotion at the entrance caught Jason's attention. He turned his head, his fake smile freezing instantly. He saw the Maybach pulling away. He saw the flashes of the press cameras. And then he saw me. For a fraction of a second, absolute shock completely wiped the arrogance from his face. His brain simply could not process the visual data. The woman he had kicked out of his car into the freezing rain was now gliding across the red carpet of the Four Seasons, commanding the attention of the entire local media. But Jason's ego was a blinding, incurable disease. His shock quickly mutated into furious, deeply insecure rage. He could not fathom that I possessed my own power. In his twisted reality, I was nothing without him. He broke away from his circle and marched directly toward me, intercepting me right in the center of the grand archway leading into the ballroom. "What the hell are you doing here, Stella?" Jason demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, vicious whisper before he deliberately raised it for the surrounding guests to hear. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to reassert his dominance. "You actually tracked me down to a private invite-only charity gala. This is beyond pathetic. You are stalking me." I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still, looking at him with an expression of pure, glacial indifference. I did not say a word. My absolute silence only infuriated him more. Jason gestured dismissively toward my emerald gown, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his features. "Look at you. You actually took the tiny, pathetic divorce settlement the judge threw at you and blew every single penny on a cheap rental dress just to crash my party. You wanted to pretend you still belong in the billionaire bracket. You are bleeding yourself dry just to stand in my shadow." Sienna, noticing the confrontation, strutted over to join him. Amber and DeAndre flanked her, forming a solid wall of hostile arrogance. Sienna looked me up and down, her eyes full of venomous spite. "Security is going to have a field day with you," Sienna announced, her voice pitched loudly enough to draw the attention of the nearby tech journalists. "This is a closed event for serious investors and high society donors, Stella. Desperate, obsessed ex-wives do not make the guest list. You need to turn around and walk back to whatever cheap motel you are living in before we have you arrested for trespassing." Amber let out a loud, theatrical laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Oh my God, this is genuinely embarrassing to watch. She is actually trying to crash a billionaire's gala. Look at her standing there. She has absolutely nothing left, so she is begging for scraps of attention. DeAndre, take your phone out. You have to record this. People are not going to believe she actually showed up here looking like a desperate stalker. DeAndre pulled his smartphone from his tuxedo jacket, aiming the camera directly at my face. He laughed a deep, mocking sound. Smile for the camera, Stella. Let everyone see what happens when the trash refuses to stay in the dumpster. Go ahead, begged Jason to take you back. We could all use some entertainment before the real investors arrive. The surrounding guests began to murmur. Several venture capitalists and local socialites turned to watch the spectacle. Their champagne glasses paused mid-air. Jason puffed out his chest, reveling in the public humiliation he believed he was inflicting upon me. He thought he was proving his ultimate superiority. He thought he was destroying me in front of the entire Seattle elite. I looked at Jason, then at Sienna, Amber, and DeAndre. I took in their smug, arrogant faces, entirely oblivious to the federal crosshairs painted directly on their chests. They were insulting me, laughing at me, and recording my supposed downfall, completely unaware that the executioner had already arrived. I maintained my absolute perfect silence, letting them dig their graves as deep as they possibly could. I just waited for the music to stop. Sienna aggressively waved her hand high in the air, signaling the hotel security team stationed near the grand staircase. She was not content with merely insulting me privately in the foyer. She wanted a brutal public execution. She raised her voice, pitching it to carry over the ambient chatter of the ballroom, deliberately broadcasting her lies to the surrounding wealthy guests, aggressive venture capitalists, and eager tech journalists. Security, we have a major breach at the main entrance, Sienna announced, her tone dripping with manufactured panic and theatrical distress. You need to remove this woman immediately. She is a deranged homeless trespasser who somehow sneaked past the valet stand. She is violently obsessed with our chief executive officer, and she is actively harassing our VIP guests. Please get her out of here right now before she hurts someone. The surrounding crowd of elite investors and socialites audibly gasped. Conversations stopped dead in their tracks. Crystal champagne glasses were lowered. Dozens of highly influential people turned their undivided attention toward the main archway, staring at me with a mixture of utter shock and morbid fascination. DeAndre seized the golden opportunity to elevate his own twisted status on the internet. He pulled his smartphone from his custom tuxedo pocket and instantly launched a live stream to his massive following on social media. He shoved the camera lens mere inches from my face, his loud, booming voice echoing harshly across the polished marble foyer. Look at this pathetic display, folks. DeAndre narrated, pacing around me, like a hype man at a heavyweight boxing match. The broke, desperate ex-wife is actually trying to crash a billionaire charity gala. She went and rented a fake designer dress just to sneak in here and beg for spare change. Watch closely, everyone. You are about to see the hotel trash get violently taken out to the dumpster where she belongs. Hit that share button. You do not want to miss this. Amber leaned heavily into the frame of the camera, flashing a vicious, perfectly glossed smile for the thousands of viewers joining the digital stream. Tell your followers how she could not handle the divorce. Amber chimed in, tossing her hair over her shoulder with exaggerated elegance. Tell them she completely lost her mind when Jason cut off her credit cards. She is completely unhinged and dangerous. This is what complete financial ruin looks like, people. She has absolutely nothing left. Jason stood slightly behind them, his chest puffed out with intoxicating, blinding pride. He was reveling in the cruel spectacle unfolding before his eyes. He folded his arms across his expensive tuxedo and looked at me with eyes full of malicious glee. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, lowering his voice so only I could hear his venomous promise. You thought you could embarrass me tonight by showing up here, Jason whispered, his breath warm and repulsive against my cheek. But you just gave me the perfect public relations gift. The local media is going to publish high-resolution photos of you being dragged out of my gala in handcuffs. I'm going to make sure your mugshot is printed on the front page of the Financial Times tomorrow morning. I'm going to make an example out of you. You are entirely finished, Stella. Two massive hotel security guards pushed their way through the growing crowd of onlookers. They wore dark, imposing suits and stern expressions, their hands resting firmly on their tactical utility belts. They were well accustomed to removing unruly guests from high society events, and they clearly wanted to quickly appease the wealthy tech CEO who had rented their grand ballroom for the evening. Sienna pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "Do not just stand there and look at her," she ordered the guards, her voice shrill with aggressive, unchecked authority. "I told you she is volatile and incredibly dangerous. Restrain her right now. Use zip ties before she attacks one of our key investors. Do your jobs." The guards exchanged a brief professional glance. They nodded in unison, stepping heavily into my personal space. One of the massive men unclipped a pair of heavy industrial plastic zip ties from his tactical belt. He reached his large hands out, preparing to forcibly grab my wrists and twist my arms behind my back. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. The journalists raised their heavy cameras, their fingers hovering over the shutter buttons, ready to capture the exact moment the disgraced former wife was physically subdued and utterly humiliated. I felt the heat of the camera flash on my skin. I felt the aggressive proximity of the security guards. I felt the suffocating weight of 100 wealthy onlookers judging my every single breath. But my heart rate did not elevate. The adrenaline rushing through my veins was not born of panic or fear. It was the icy, controlled anticipation of an apex predator. I had meticulously orchestrated this entire evening down to the very last fraction of a second. I knew exactly what was moving through the hotel service elevators. I knew exactly who was waiting in the loading docks. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not break my immaculate posture or show a single ounce of the fear they so desperately wanted to see. I stood rooted to the polished marble floor like a statue carved from absolute unbreakable ice. I slowly and deliberately lifted my left arm. The dark emerald silk of my custom gown fell back, exposing my wrist to the harsh, glaring lights of the lobby chandeliers. Resting against my skin was a breathtaking custom-engineered timepiece heavily encrusted with flawless diamonds. It was a watch that cost substantially more than Jason's entire stolen bridge loan. It was a physical symbol of undisputed, terrifying wealth provided directly from the Kensington estate vault. The heavy chandelier light caught the brilliant cut diamonds, scattering blinding prismatic reflections across the faces of the approaching security guards. The guard holding the industrial zip ties froze mid-step, his eyes locked onto the glowing timepiece. He was professionally trained to recognize the subtle markers of true high society power, and the blinding display of wealth strapped to my wrist fundamentally short-circuited his direct orders. A homeless, deranged trespasser does not wear a multi-million-dollar piece of horological art to a corporate gala. I ignored the hesitant guards entirely. I looked down at the diamond-encrusted watch, my expression remaining completely unbothered and utterly serene. I noted the precise position of the glowing hands. I checked the exact passing second. The timing of this execution had to be utterly flawless. I lowered my arm and slowly lifted my gaze, locking my eyes dead onto Jason. I did not blink. I did not speak a single word. I simply stared at him with the cold, calculating, and lethal intensity of a hunter watching its prey step willingly into a steel trap. I let a slow, chilling smile touch the very corners of my mouth. Jason saw the smile. He saw the impossible, unnatural calm radiating from my posture. He saw the blinding flash of the diamonds on my wrist. For the very first time since he had shoved me out of his luxury vehicle into the freezing rain, his arrogant smirk began to waver. A sudden microscopic fracture of genuine doubt appeared in his eyes. His brain struggled to process why the woman he was actively destroying looked like she was standing directly over his open grave. He was about to find out. Before the security guard could even close the zip tie around my wrist, a deafening screech of audio feedback ripped through the grand ballroom. The upbeat, sophisticated jazz music abruptly cut off. The sudden absolute silence in the massive hall was jarring. The chattering of hundreds of wealthy guests died instantly. Every head turned toward the main entrance. Through the heavy silence, a sharp, rhythmic sound echoed across the polished marble floor. Clack, clack, clack. It was the unmistakable sound of a silver-handled cane striking the stone tiles with brutal, unyielding authority. The massive bronze doors at the far end of the foyer swung open with a heavy mechanical groan. A dozen elite private security contractors marched into the hotel. These were not the hotel's standard security guards. These were highly trained operatives, wearing tactical black suits and earpieces, moving with strict military precision. They immediately formed a protective wedge, physically forcing the crowd of venture capitalists and tech journalists to part like the Red Sea. Walking directly through the center of that human corridor was Beatrice Kensington. She wore a sharp, immaculate black coat draped over her shoulders and dark sunglasses shielding her sightless eyes. Even in her advanced age, she radiated an aura of absolute terrifying power that commanded immediate submission from everyone in the room. The entire ballroom fell into a breathless, suffocated hush. Every single person in the Seattle financial district knew exactly who she was. She was the queen of venture capital. She was the woman who could make or break a billionaire with a single signature. Jason stood paralyzed just inches away from me. I watched his eyes widen as the color rushed back into his face. His microscopic doubt instantly vanished, replaced by a surge of manic, desperate joy. In his twisted, narcissistic reality, Beatrice Kensington walking into his charity gala meant only one thing. He actually believed she had succumbed to his media pressure. He thought she was here to publicly hand him the $50 million check. He aggressively smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo. He leaned back towards Sienna, his voice buzzing with frantic excitement. "Look at this," Jason whispered loudly. "She came. She actually came in person. I told you the media ambush would work. We won, Sienna. We secured the 50 million." Sienna gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in sheer ecstasy. Amber grabbed DeAndre's arm, bouncing on her heels. DeAndre immediately raised his smartphone higher, adjusting the angle of his live stream to capture Beatrice's arrival, eager to broadcast his proximity to ultimate wealth. Jason completely forgot about having me arrested. He shoved past the hotel security guards, pushing his way toward the center of the foyer to intercept the billionaire matriarch. He extended his hand, pasting on his most charming, sycophantic smile. "Madam Chairman," Jason announced, projecting his voice for the journalists to hear. "It is an absolute honor to welcome you to the Vanguard Innovation Gala. We are so incredibly thrilled that you decided to join our celebration. Let me personally escort you to the VIP stage." Beatrice did not stop walking. She did not even turn her head toward his voice. Her elite security detail simply stepped forward, planting a firm, unyielding hand firmly against Jason's chest. The guard physically shoved the logistics CEO backward, treating him like an insignificant insect blocking their path. Jason stumbled, his smile faltering as he nearly tripped over his own expensive shoes. Beatrice marched past him without uttering a single word. She approached the grand staircase overlooking the main ballroom. The hotel general manager, sweating profusely and trembling with nervous energy, sprinted forward to hand her a wireless microphone. Beatrice took the microphone. She turned to face the vast sea of wealthy investors and hungry reporters. She tapped her cane against the marble step one final time, bringing the entire venue to a dead ringing halt. "Ladies and gentlemen," Beatrice's voice boomed through the massive speaker system. It was a cold, commanding tone that required absolutely no amplification to convey dominance. "I built Kensington Holdings 50 years ago with my bare hands. I transformed this city into a global technology hub. I have watched generations of visionaries build empires, and I have watched generations of greedy, incompetent parasites try to steal from them." The crowd remained entirely motionless, hanging on to her every syllable. Jason stood a few feet away, frantically nodding along, still hopelessly convinced she was building up to announcing his investment. "As many of you have speculated, my physical health is declining." Beatrice continued, her voice slicing through the tense air. "My vision is gone. The corporate vultures sitting on my own executive board have spent the last 3 months circling my chair, waiting for me to step down so they can carve up my life's work and sell it for scraps. They thought I was too weak to protect my own legacy. They were entirely wrong." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. This was unprecedented. The notoriously secretive billionaire was airing her corporate warfare on live television. Effective immediately. Beatrice declared, "I am officially stepping down as the acting head of Kensington Holdings. I am bypassing my board of directors completely." I am liquidating their voting power and executing a hostile internal takeover of my own company. I have spent the last week searching for a successor. I needed a financial architect with uncorrupted vision, a razor-sharp intellect, and the absolute ruthlessness required to purge the rot from my industry. Jason puffed out his chest, stepping forward again, adjusting his tie as if preparing to accept an Academy Award. He truly believed he was the visionary she was describing. He was ready to walk up those stairs and claim his crown. "I have found my successor," Beatrice announced, raising her voice to a resounding authoritative crescendo. "I hereby introduce the new sole heir, the undisputed majority shareholder, and the acting chief executive officer of the Kensington Holdings $40 billion empire." Beatrice did not gesture toward Jason. She raised her cane and pointed it directly toward the back of the foyer. The head lighting technician, following strict prearranged orders from Beatrice's security team, executed the command. The massive, brilliant white spotlight mounted on the ballroom balcony swung violently away from the center stage. The blinding beam of light sliced through the darkness of the hall, sweeping right past Jason, past Sienna, past Amber, and past DeAndre. The spotlight locked dead onto me. I stood bathed in the blinding, radiant glow. The flawless diamonds around my neck and on my wrist caught the intense beam, igniting like crushed stars. The deep emerald silk of my gown practically glowed. I did not shrink from the light. I held my head high, staring straight ahead with absolute unwavering dominance. The entire ballroom turned to follow the spotlight. Hundreds of cameras flashed simultaneously, capturing the exact image of the woman they had just been told was a deranged homeless trespasser. The silence was absolute, deafening, and completely shattered by the reality of my ascension. The two massive security guards who had been mere inches away from restraining me froze completely. The thick plastic zip ties fell from their hands, clattering sharply against the polished marble floor. Their faces instantly drained of all color, shifting from aggressive authority to absolute paralyzing terror. They recognized the power dynamics of the room shifting in a microsecond. The men scrambled backward, creating a wide, respectful perimeter around me. They lowered their heads in silent, terrified apology, terrified of the woman they had almost assaulted on behalf of a fraud. Jason's reality violently fractured. I watched the cognitive dissonance tear through his brain, destroying his fragile ego piece by piece. His smug, arrogant smirk dissolved, replaced by a look of sheer, suffocating horror. His jaw went slack. The man who had abandoned me in a freezing rainstorm, who had spent the last 20 minutes loudly mocking my existence to Seattle's elite, suddenly realized he was standing in the shadow of a financial titan. I was a microscopic insect staring up at a descending boot. Sienna stood frozen beside him, her perfectly manicured fingers going entirely limp. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp and plummeted to the floor. The glass shattered with a sharp, explosive crash that echoed like a gunshot through the sudden silence of the grand foyer. Splinters of crystal and expensive vintage champagne splashed against her designer heels, but she did not even flinch. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with the dawning, horrific realization that her stolen penthouse and high society dreams were actively burning to the ground right before her eyes. DeAndre, who had been aggressively shoving his smartphone in my face, slowly lowered his arm. The live stream he had initiated to publicly humiliate me was still broadcasting to thousands of viewers. But his hands were trembling so violently the camera feed shook erratically. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as the terrifying weight of his fraudulent federal tax returns crashed down upon him. He knew I had the ultimate power, and the look in my eyes told him I knew every single one of his dirty secrets. Amber stood completely immobilized beside him, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Her previous cruel laughter replaced by breathless panic. I did not offer them a single glance of pity. I did not waste my breath gloating or returning their insults. I simply walked forward. My stilettos clicked against the marble, a steady, lethal rhythm that parted the sea of Seattle's most powerful elites. Billionaires, ruthless venture capitalists, and hungry tech journalists eagerly scrambled out of my way, their eyes locked on me with a mixture of profound reverence and deep fear. I walked right past Jason. He reached out a trembling hand, his voice a pathetic broken whisper uttering my name like a prayer for mercy. I did not stop. I did not acknowledge his existence. He was a ghost, a pathetic relic of a past I had already buried. I approached the grand staircase. Beatrice's elite security team immediately stepped aside, clearing the path for their new chief executive. I ascended the marble steps gracefully, the deep emerald silk of my custom gown trailing beautifully behind me. When I reached the top landing, Beatrice Kensington turned her head slightly, offering me a grim, highly approving nod. She reached out and handed me the wireless microphone. I turned to face the vast expanse of the grand ballroom. The brilliant white spotlight tracked my movement, illuminating me perfectly before the massive crowd. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw the rapid flash of cameras, the glowing red recording lights of local news crews, and the expectant eyes of the entire financial world. And right in the center of the foyer, looking up at the balcony, I saw Jason, Sienna, Amber, and DeAndre. They looked like condemned prisoners waiting for the executioner to pull the heavy iron lever. "Good evening," I began, my voice carrying clear and absolute authority through the massive hotel speaker system. "My name is Stella, and effective immediately I hold the absolute majority control and acting executive authority of Kensington Holdings." A wave of frantic typing and hushed excited murmurs swept through the dense press pool. I let the silence return before delivering the lethal blow. Kensington Holdings built its elite reputation on identifying true market innovation and ruthlessly eliminating corporate decay. I continued, my eyes locking dead onto Jason's pale, sweating face. "We were recently approached by Vanguard Logistics. They submitted a highly publicized request for a $50 million Series C investment round. The CEO of Vanguard Logistics rented this very ballroom tonight, inviting the media and his respected peers to aggressively pressure our firm into finalizing this massive acquisition." Jason took a small, unsteady step back, his hands flying to his head as he realized exactly what I had been doing during his 90-day exclusivity period. He realized I possessed his internal ledgers. "Tonight was intended to be a grand celebration of a historic partnership," I announced, projecting my voice to reach every single corner of the opulent venue. "Instead, it will serve as a definitive, brutal lesson in corporate compliance. I have personally concluded a comprehensive forensic shadow audit of Vanguard Logistics. I have reviewed every single operational ledger, every offshore routing number, and every claim of intellectual property presented in their flashy pitch deck." The entire ballroom held its breath. The journalists leaned forward, sensing the impending corporate slaughter. "Therefore, on behalf of Kensington Holdings, I am publicly, officially, and unequivocally rejecting the $50 million funding request from Vanguard Logistics." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Journalists shouted rapid-fire questions, wealthy investors gasped in genuine shock, and camera flashes intensified into a blinding, chaotic storm. Rejecting a tech startup publicly in front of the press was unheard of. It was a calculated financial death sentence. It instantly and permanently blacklisted his company from every other venture capital firm on the entire globe. Jason let out a strangled, agonizing cry, a sound of pure, helpless devastation that cut through the noise of the crowd. He lunged forward desperately, trying to push his way past the wealthy guests, screaming wildly that there was a misunderstanding, screaming that I was a bitter ex-wife carrying out a personal vendetta. But his frantic voice was entirely drowned out by the aggressive shouting of reporters demanding more details. I raised my free hand, demanding absolute silence. The room obeyed instantly, eager for the next drop of blood. The execution was not over. Rejecting his funding was merely the beginning of the slaughter. I had promised Beatrice I would dismantle his entire existence, and I was going to do it with undeniable, irrefutable proof right now. I raised my left hand, gesturing crisply toward the elevated sound and lighting booth located high above the ballroom floor. The head audiovisual technician who had received my encrypted hard drive earlier that afternoon, under strict non-disclosure agreements, executed the final command. The massive high-definition projection screens flanking the grand staircase instantly flashed to life. The brilliant, stark white glow of raw financial data bathed the entire ballroom in an unforgiving, clinical light. I did not just reject Vanguard Logistics, I brought the autopsy report. "Look at the screens behind me," I instructed, my voice cutting cleanly through the rising tide of panicked whispers. What you are currently viewing is the foundational source code for the Vanguard predictive supply chain algorithm. This is the very technology Jason claimed he built from scratch. It is the sole digital asset driving his company's entire market valuation. I pressed a button on the sleek wireless remote resting in my palm. The screen zoomed in sharply on the digital developer logs. Notice the embedded timestamps. Notice the encrypted author's signatures dating back 3 grueling years. Every single line of that complex routing logic, every advanced mathematical equation, and every predictive global shipping model was written exclusively by me. I built that architecture from the ground up while sitting in a cramped guest bedroom. Jason illegally wiped my name from the federal patent filings and committed massive intellectual property theft. Vanguard Logistics does not own its core technology. Therefore, the company valuation is officially zero. A collective gasp ripped through the dense crowd of Seattle elites. The tech journalists furiously typed on their illuminated tablets, realizing they were breaking the biggest corporate fraud story of the decade. Venture capitalists who had previously considered backing Jason stared at the screens in pure, unadulterated horror. They were looking at a worthless hollow company built entirely on a massive, undeniable lie. Jason stood frozen in the center of the foyer, his mouth hanging open in dumbfounded shock. He tried to speak, to formulate a lie, to deny the undeniable evidence, but absolutely no words came out. The physical proof of his federal crime was towering 50 feet above his head. But intellectual property theft is merely the foundation of his deceit. I continued stepping closer to the edge of the marble balcony. The screens shifted abruptly. The complex lines of green code were instantly replaced by highly detailed financial flowcharts. Thick red arrows traced the illicit movement of massive sums of capital. I draw your attention to the current operational ledgers of Vanguard Logistics. Specifically, I am highlighting the capital provided by the early-stage angel investors who are sitting in this very room tonight. I clicked the remote again. High-resolution scans of federal tax filings, offshore bank statements, and property deeds materialized on the massive displays. Jason has been actively looting his own company. He systematically siphoned millions of dollars in your investor capital through fake vendor invoices to a dummy corporation called Apex Horizon Solutions. I highlighted the routing numbers with a bright digital laser. That shell company is legally registered to DeAndre, the man currently standing in the foyer sweating through his custom tuxedo. DeAndre gladly signed fraudulent federal tax documents to act as the illegal frontman for a massive embezzlement syndicate. DeAndre stumbled backward, crashing heavily into a tall cocktail table. A tray of champagne glasses toppled over, shattering loudly on the floor, but nobody paid the broken glass any attention. DeAndre threw his hands over his face, shaking his head violently, as the entire ballroom turned to glare at him. The flashing cameras of the press corps pivoted, capturing his absolute, undeniable guilt. Amber shrieked desperately, trying to hide behind a towering floral arrangement, but the glaring light of the projectors exposed her completely to the furious crowd. The final piece of the puzzle flashed onto the screens. It was a certified property deed paired perfectly with a corresponding wire transfer receipt from a Cayman Islands bank. "Where exactly did your stolen investor capital go?" I asked, my voice rising in volume and lethal intensity. It did not go toward global expansion. It did not go toward marketing or acquiring new freight contracts. It went directly into an all-cash purchase of a $3 million luxury penthouse in downtown Seattle. And the sole owner listed on that deed is Sienna, the vice president of operations. The room absolutely exploded. It was no longer just shocked murmurs or surprised gasps. It was pure, volatile, uncontained fury. Several early-stage investors who were attending the gala suddenly realized they had been personally and brutally robbed. They had written massive, multi-million-dollar checks expecting aggressive corporate growth, only to watch their hard-earned money buy a luxury mansion for a cheating CEO's mistress. A senior partner at a prominent local seed fund, a man who had personally vouched for Jason in the Seattle business community, turned a violent shade of purple. He slammed his glass down on a table and screamed at Jason, demanding his money back right this second. Another furious executive lunged forward, grabbing Jason violently by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo, shouting that he was going to sue him into absolute oblivion. Sienna covered her ears, backing away in sheer terror as furious defrauded investors closed in around her. The high society crowd she had so desperately wanted to impress was now looking at her with absolute disgust and violent anger. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was a petty thief wearing stolen money, and everyone in the room knew it. Jason violently shoved the angry investor away from his chest, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. He looked up at me on the balcony, his face twisted in a terrifying mask of pure, desperate hatred. He realized he was not just losing the $50 million venture capital payout. He was losing his freedom. The furious mob of defrauded investors was actively surrounding them, physically blocking any path to the hotel exits. I stood perfectly still on the marble balcony, looking down at the absolute chaos I had flawlessly orchestrated. The financial execution was complete. Every single lie they had ever told was currently projected in high definition for the entire financial sector to read, record, and publish. They were entirely ruined, financially dismantled, and publicly slaughtered. But I was not finished. The corporate execution was merely the bloody prelude to the criminal one. The furious shouting of the defrauded investors was suddenly drowned out by a sound far more terrifying. A piercing, synchronized wail of heavy federal sirens tore through the cold Seattle night. Brilliant strobing flashes of red and blue light violently pierced the sheer floor-to-ceiling windows of the Four Seasons Grand Ballroom. The alternating aggressive colors washed over the massive crystal chandeliers, casting frantic, chaotic shadows across the faces of the panicked high society guests. The financial slaughter I had initiated was officially transitioning into a full-scale federal raid. The heavy gold-plated doors of the main hotel entrance were thrown open with such explosive physical force that they slammed against the marble walls, completely shattering the surrounding floral arrangements. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, moving in flawless tactical coordination with senior investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, stormed directly into the grand foyer. They wore dark, imposing tactical gear with bold yellow lettering across their chests and backs. They moved with absolute uncompromising authority, sweeping through the luxurious space like a highly trained military unit. Agents immediately fanned out across the venue, physically blocking every single exit, securing the perimeter, and establishing absolute control over the massive ballroom. A senior federal agent raised a heavy megaphone to his mouth, his voice booming aggressively over the rising panic of the wealthy crowd. Nobody moves a single muscle. This is a federal raid executed under the direct authority of the United States Department of Justice. Stay exactly where you are and keep your hands clearly visible. The angry mob of venture capitalists and early-stage investors immediately backed away from Jason, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a federal indictment. The crowd rapidly parted, leaving the four criminals completely isolated and horribly exposed in the center of the polished marble floor. DeAndre looked at the advancing tactical vests, the heavy weapons, and the relentless strobing police lights illuminating the room. The reality of a 20-year federal prison sentence for corporate tax fraud crashed down upon him like a falling concrete vault. His survival instinct instantaneously obliterated any lingering trace of family loyalty. He threw his hands high into the air, falling hard to his knees, before a single federal agent even approached his position. I did not just surrender. He actively detonated the very last remaining shred of Jason's legal defense. I will testify. DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking with absolute hyperventilating terror. I will give you everything you want. He made me do it. Jason forced me to sign those fraudulent tax documents. He used my name to buy those luxury houses. I have the emails. I have the text messages on a secure server. I will turn state's evidence right now. Just tell me where to sign. Please, I am fully cooperating with the federal government. Jason stared at his brother-in-law in pure, unadulterated shock. The last supportive pillar of his fraudulent empire had just publicly crumbled. He was completely exposed, betrayed, and abandoned by his most crucial accomplice in front of the entire Seattle press corps. Absolute blinding panic finally overrode his crippling narcissism. Jason spun around, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. He tried to sprint toward the grand staircase, desperately hoping to lose himself in the dense, panicked crowd of socialites and slip out a side door. I did not even make it 5 steps. 3 massive federal agents closed the distance in a fraction of a second. They tackled the logistics chief executive officer with brutal, uncompromising physical force. Jason slammed face first into the hard marble floor. The heavy impact knocked the breath entirely out of his lungs, replacing his arrogant demands with a choked gasp of pain. An agent drove a heavy knee directly into the center of Jason's spine, pinning him flat and helpless against the cold ground. "Grab his arms," the lead agent shouted, issuing rapid commands to his tactical team. They violently wrenched Jason's arms behind his back. The sharp, distinctive click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the quieted foyer. The tech journalists and media photographers, realizing they were witnessing the absolute pinnacle of corporate destruction, surged forward against the security perimeter. Hundreds of camera flashes erupted simultaneously, bathing Jason in a blinding, relentless strobe light. They captured every single angle of his ultimate physical humiliation. The arrogant billionaire who had rented this opulent ballroom to secure his vast fortune was now pressing his bruised cheek against the floor, restrained exactly like a common street criminal. Sienna watched Jason go down. She realized the offshore accounts, the luxury penthouse, and her high society dreams were entirely gone. Panic consumed her logic. She hiked up the heavy, expensive fabric of her designer gown and sprinted. She bolted away from the main foyer, desperately navigating through the bewildered crowd of guests, making a frantic dash toward the swinging wooden doors of the hotel's commercial kitchen. She thought she could slip through the service corridors, bypass the federal perimeter, and vanish into the dark Seattle night. She severely underestimated the tactical efficiency of the federal task force. A female agent from the Securities and Exchange Commission, anticipating that exact escape route, stepped out from behind a towering ice sculpture. The agent planted her boots firmly, lowered her shoulder, and tackled Sienna directly to the floor. Sienna went down hard, sliding forcefully across the polished marble. Her designer heels flew off her feet, clattering away into the crowd. The agent swiftly pinned Sienna down, securing her wrists with heavy industrial zip ties. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud," the agent announced coldly, hauling the struggling, crying mistress roughly to her feet. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Amber was the only one left standing in the center of the devastated foyer. She looked at her husband groveling on the floor, begging federal agents for a plea deal. She looked at her older brother lying completely incapacitated and handcuffed under the heavy weight of the tactical team. She looked at the mistress being marched back into the main lobby in aggressive plastic restraints. The crushing, undeniable reality finally broke her mind. The stolen wealth that had funded her entire entitled, arrogant existence was actively being seized by the federal government. She would be completely penniless, homeless, and facing severe criminal conspiracy charges by morning. Amber collapsed heavily to her knees, clutching her head tightly in her hands. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed painfully across the massive ballroom. She sobbed uncontrollably, thrashing on the floor as she realized she was about to trade her stolen luxury lifestyle for an orange jumpsuit and a cold concrete cell. I stood perfectly still on the marble balcony, overlooking the entire scene, standing shoulder to shoulder with Beatrice Kensington. I watched the flashing lights, the handcuffs, and the absolute destruction of the people who had abandoned me in the freezing rain. The federal strike was flawless. The execution was absolute. The apex predator had thoroughly consumed her prey. The apex predator had thoroughly consumed her prey. The aftermath of the federal raid was swift, surgical, and utterly ruthless. I did not stay to watch them drag Jason through the hotel lobby in handcuffs. I had already witnessed the exact moment his fragile, arrogant spirit broke, and that was all the closure I required. The United States justice system took over from there, operating with a crushing mechanical efficiency that left absolutely no room for negotiation, manipulation, or escape. DeAndre kept his desperate, hyperventilating promise to the federal authorities. Terrified of spending the rest of his life in a maximum security facility, he immediately turned state's evidence. He sat in a sterile, windowless interrogation room and eagerly detailed every single fraudulent real estate transaction, every offshore routing number, and every illegal directive Jason had ever given him. DeAndre traded his family loyalty for a 5-year plea deal in a low-security federal prison. His comprehensive confession completely buried his brother-in-law. The federal prosecutors did not even need to take Jason to trial. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence, my unredacted shadow audit, and DeAndre's sworn testimony, Jason's high-priced corporate defense attorneys advised him to surrender immediately. He stood before a federal judge stripped of his expensive designer suits and his arrogant swagger, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Through his lawyer, Jason sent a pathetic, tear-stained letter to my office, begging me to speak on his behalf, pleading for mercy, and reminding me of the years we spent together. I ran the letter through a paper shredder and sent the shreds back to his holding cell in a blank envelope. The judge showed zero leniency for a man who had defrauded investors and stolen intellectual property to fund a lavish, illicit lifestyle. Jason was convicted of massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand theft of intellectual property. He received a crushing 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. His billionaire dreams evaporated into the cold concrete reality of a 6x8 cell. Sienna thought she could simply detach herself from the wreckage, bat her eyelashes, and charm her way into another lucrative corporate position. She severely underestimated the sheer aggressive firepower of the Kensington Holdings legal department. With Beatrice's full authorization, our litigation team launched a relentless barrage of civil lawsuits against her for her active role in the embezzlement syndicate. We tied her up in federal court for months, freezing her remaining personal accounts and aggressively seizing the luxury penthouse she had purchased with my stolen money. The intense, highly publicized legal battle completely drained her finances, leaving her absolutely bankrupt. Furthermore, the public exposure of her crimes rendered her utterly toxic in the corporate world. No respectable company on the entire West Coast would dare hire a disgraced operations manager publicly known for aiding massive corporate fraud. Sienna was permanently blacklisted, forced to disappear into total financial obscurity. Amber faced a similarly brutal reality check. Because DeAndre had used their marital assets to facilitate the money laundering operation, the federal government initiated immediate aggressive asset forfeiture. Federal marshals seized their sprawling suburban mansion, their imported luxury vehicles, and every single designer item purchased with illicit funds. Amber was violently evicted, thrown out onto the street with nothing but a single suitcase of basic clothing. The entitled, arrogant woman who had laughed at me, freezing in the rain, was abruptly forced to face actual grueling survival. With no education, no job history, and a husband in federal prison, Amber had to rent a tiny rundown apartment in a dangerous, dilapidated neighborhood. To pay her meager rent and avoid homelessness, she was forced to take a punishing minimum wage job, cleaning office buildings on the night shift. Every single day, she had to scrub the floors of the very financial institutions her brother had once tried to defraud, a permanent, exhausting reminder of the luxury she had squandered. While my enemies were systematically destroyed, I officially reclaimed what was rightfully mine. Utilizing the elite corporate attorneys at Kensington Holdings, I petitioned the federal bankruptcy court during the liquidation phase of Vanguard Logistics. Because I possessed the original developer logs and the undeniable metadata, proving my authorship, the court officially restored my full, unadulterated legal ownership of the predictive supply chain algorithm. I did not stop there. I purchased the liquidated, dismantled remnants of Jason's ruined company for absolute pennies on the dollar. I fired his remaining corrupt executives, dissolved the Vanguard branding entirely, and absorbed the functional logistics infrastructure directly into the Kensington portfolio. I erased Jason's legacy from the business world with a single stroke of my pen. He was nothing but a cautionary tale, a pathetic footnote in a textbook about corporate greed. 6 months after the gala, the brutal dust had finally settled. I stood on the top floor balcony of the Kensington Holdings Executive Tower. The crisp, biting air of the Pacific Northwest whipped around me. I wore a tailored, immaculate black suit, the physical armor of my new reality. Beside me stood Beatrice, her hands resting firmly on her silver-handled cane. We looked out over the glittering, sprawling Seattle skyline, the towering glass skyscrapers, the bustling shipping ports, and the endless network of global commerce stretched out beneath us. We shared no blood, we shared no biological history, but standing on that balcony high above the city that had once tried to break me, I realized we had forged a family bond far stronger than mere genetics. We had built an unbreakable, terrifying empire based entirely on absolute loyalty, razor-sharp intellect, and a shared, uncompromising vision. We had proven that true power does not come from deceit or arrogant entitlement. True power comes from the quiet, calculated observation of the world and the willingness to act with absolute unwavering conviction when the moment requires it. Beatrice turned her face toward the cold wind, a deep, satisfied smile touching the corners of her mouth. She knew her legacy was perfectly secure in my hands. I looked down at the streets below, remembering the desperate, freezing woman who had begged for a ride. She was gone forever. In her place stood the undisputed architect of her own destiny. We had executed a flawless billion-dollar takedown. We had systematically dismantled every single person who had mistaken our kindness for weakness. And looking out over our glittering financial empire, I knew with absolute unshakable certainty that no one would ever dare make that fatal mistake again. The story of Stella serves as a masterclass in the dangerous illusion of conditional loyalty and the profound strength found in radical self-reliance. We often sacrifice our own potential to build up the people we love, ignoring the red flags of their arrogance and greed. Stella gave her husband her brilliance and her loyalty only to be discarded the moment she outlived her perceived usefulness. The defining lesson here is that true power does not come from waiting for validation from toxic individuals. It is born the exact second you stop playing the victim, establish unbreakable boundaries, and reclaim your own narrative.